Good afternoon. If there are people in the lobby who don't want to miss Sir Ken Robinson, I'd encourage you to invite them to come on in. It's my pleasure to introduce Sir Ken Robinson. I, probably like many of you, first met him online, right? Because his TED Talk's been watched more than any other TED Talk in the history of TED Talks. And when I first watched it, I wanted to accuse him of plagiarism, because so many of the things I'd been writing about and speaking about, there he had it very concisely and far more masterfully, because he has that English accent. He just put it all together. And ever since then, I've been a fan. And this past summer, I had a chance to actually meet him. I told him about what we were doing with this center and with this conference, and he immediately said, if I'm available, I'll be there. And lo and behold, he's here. So I'm really thankful to you, Ken, for making the time. Ken is on the road often. It's hard to catch him when he's in Los Angeles. My dean, Marcelo Suarez Orozco, who you met earlier today, when he met him, welcomed him to Los Angeles and found out that he's been living in LA longer than Marcelo. So it's truly an honor to have him here at this conference to help us in pushing our thinking about what's possible with children and with education. Sir Ken Robinson.
Thank you, Pedro. Do you have my microphone? Oh, that one over there. I could have done that myself. But Edwin's being paid to do it. So, thank you, Edwin. Appreciate it. This has been great, hasn't it? Today, it's been fantastic. It's true, I live in Los Angeles. I've lived here now for almost 17 years. I live around the corner, as it turns out. And so it was lovely when Marcelo welcomed me to Los Angeles. Why don't people think I'm from Los Angeles? I don't understand, do you? But I moved here. I live here. I moved here not long after No Child Left Behind started leaving children behind. And I love Los Angeles, I have to say, and also America, and, well, California, let's be frank. And people were talking this morning about being aliens and alienated. I am an alien. I just want you to know this. I am officially an alien. I have a green card from this country. I am officially a resident alien. So thank you. And yet I move among you. And I'm taken for one of your own. Actually, 6 months ago, I applied for citizenship. Thank you. I might have picked a better time, you know. Looking back, I had 17 years to do it, but I did it this way instead. Anyway, look, I live around the corner from here, and I travel a lot, as Pedro said, and I have been driven for most of my professional life by the same mission, really, and the same set of interests and values, and they've been evident throughout the whole morning. I got here about 10:30, no, 11 o'clock. Do you care when I got here? I can check it if it's bothering you. I was about to leave the house, and then I realized it was being streamed online. So I just got back into bed and watched Pedro streaming himself. But all the themes have been running through the day, including that fantastic luncheon presentation by Chef Alice, have been close to my heart for a very long time, and I think they're all connected. That's my point. I think as we talk about how to reimagine learning for the 21st century, part of what we need to do is not reimagine learning, but remember it. Because we know how to do this. You know, education and effective learning and education is not some puzzle that's just been thrust upon us. And, you know, like some new disease that we haven't encountered before and we're desperately trying to crack the genetic code. There are brilliant schools everywhere. There are fantastic teachers everywhere, wonderful school leaders everywhere, and there always have been. It's not that the situation is unfixable. We know how to fix it. The problem is that I think politically, most of our countries suffer from a form of cultural amnesia about what it is that helps people flourish. I'm involved at the moment in a couple of global campaigns. I only act globally, frankly. You know, if it's not global, I'm really not interested. So don't bother me with local nonsense. That's all I'm saying. You know, just keep it global. No, the reason I say that is every human issue presents itself locally, and you have to deal with them locally. But the issues we're talking about today are not unique to Los Angeles or California. They are genuinely global issues, and people all over the world are discussing them and trying to figure it out. And some people are more ahead than others in figuring them out and implementing the solutions. But I think this is a genuinely existential set of issues that we're discussing. How we educate our children, how we educate them to understand themselves, how we give them a sense of promise and hope and fulfillment in their communities is based, I think, on the same principles as the bigger challenges we face outside the school system in the natural environment, our relationship with the earth, our relationship as communities, our relationships politically. And they're being frustrated by the same ideological obstacles. I'm advising on this global campaign on the importance of play, children's play. We did a survey of 12,000 families in different parts of the world and discovered something really rather shocking, I think. Can I ask you, how much time did you spend as kids playing, just outside playing, in the street? A lot. Hours, probably. I mean, I did. I'm one of 7 kids. Grew up in Liverpool, and when we came home from school, we went outdoors and played. We played outside all weekend. This is in the middle of, you know, one of the toughest seaports in the world, but we just played outside. And we came back if there was food. We were like cats. You know, our parents understood this. We were feline, essentially, and if there was food outside, we would come home. And if there wasn't, we'd go to any house that had food and stay there. We just got pushed out the door and played. Up until recently, that's what kids did. They played. I don't mean computer games. I don't mean Little League. I don't mean you standing on the sidelines holding their clothes while you're shouting instructions at them. I mean just playing and being kids. What we've come to call real play. Free, unstructured, physical, active play where kids get messed up, scuff their knees, fall out, have rows, come back exhilarated and desperate to go to sleep. That type of play that we're all designed to engage in. So we asked parents, 12,000 parents in different parts of the world, 12,000 families, how much time do your children spend outdoors, typically playing? The majority of kids these days spend much less than an hour a day unsupervised outdoors. About 10% of kids never go outdoors without an adult at their side. And the vast majority don't play at all outdoors, as most of us did for most of human history. So about an hour, let's be generous, about an hour a day. But it's often much less. The international protocols for the treatment of maximum security prisoners require that they spend 2 hours a day outside. So our kids are spending less time outside than high-security prisoners. They're incarcerated in their own homes. Several reasons for it. One of them is parental fear. People are terrified if their kids go outside, awful things will happen. Statistically, they're no more at risk than children ever were. In fact, there's a good case to be made that they are, in some ways, less at risk than previous generations have been because there's so much fuss if anything does happen. But it depends, of course, on your neighborhood. We're hearing this morning some of the toughest neighborhoods in Los Angeles are not battlefields constantly. There are good places to play and always have been. There's that. There's the proliferation of digital games. I mean, when I was growing up, there's no good reason to be in the house, frankly. There's nothing there, you know. It changed when we got some furniture, but until then, obviously that made a difference when we could sit down. But generally speaking, there's no good reason to be in the house, and every good reason to get out of it. But now, you know, kids can plug themselves into devices and get lost. So there's a whole range of digital distractions. But that's not real play. And I'm not decrying it, by the way. I'm not being some kind of anti-progressive in saying digital games are bad. They're not. They're fantastic. They're very engaging. But they're not what we think of as real, active, physical, heart-pounding, running around, jumping play, which is what young children are not only designed to do, it's what they have to do if they're to grow properly, socially, emotionally, and physically. And another big pressure is school. There's terrible pressure of homework and testing and competition that is turning this generation into probably the most anxious and nerve-wracked generation in history. I want to talk a bit more about this in just a minute, but the price we're paying for all this competition in schools is an epidemic of tension and anxiety among parents and students. Like, you know it. I don't know any teacher who likes it either. It's one of those systems like, well, who's actually running this? Turns out nobody is, which is good news because it means we can change it. But, for example, South Korea is largely vaunted as the most successful system in the world in terms of testing on the PISA test, along with Shanghai and Singapore and parts of Hong Kong. South Korea and some of these other high-performing countries also have the highest rate of teen suicide anywhere in the world. So we pay a high price for this nonsense. And there was a report I saw the other day, I think it was on CBS. Might not have been, though. It could have been NBC. I'm just saying. But it happened anyway. It was a report on an experiment in Texas where a group of schools had started to allow more time every day for recess, elementary schools. So these kids are outside 3 times a day for 20 minutes running around and playing. And they were reporting. There was a reporter in the playground, you know, like they were out on some battlefront. You know, this just in, you know. I'm here, embedded in the playground in Texas. You know, as if something remarkable was taking place, and said, all around me there are children playing. Staggering, really. And they reported that the result of all this was the kids were more interested at school, they were more engaged at school. And then there was a panel in the studio where experts were debating whether this was a good thing, you know, what's the research show, is it improving test scores? And I think you have lost your mind. We have lost our minds, haven't we? If we have just rediscovered childhood in Texas as some odd phenomenon where children run around and play and they feel better if they do, and we need a panel of experts to explain to us, to try and fathom what might be going on here. We should all give up and go home, I think, at this point, because, you know, it's like, you know, we have agricultural systems of, industrial systems of agriculture, which are devastating the planet. This thin little layer of soil that surrounds the planet, on which all life of our sort depends, has taken billions of years to accumulate, and we're washing it away in a chemical mix in less than a couple of generations. It's been estimated, by the way, that in Europe, if we don't reverse this trend, we may have, optimistically, about 100 more harvests. Well, This is plain insanity, isn't it? We know there are conditions under which people flourish and conditions under which they don't. There are conditions under which all living things do well and conditions under which they don't. And the reason that so many kids don't do well in schools is not because of the kids, it's because of how we do school. And if we did school differently, the kids would do well and do better because kids want to do well. And it's kind of that straightforward. And a lot of the work I've been doing has been around this idea, like, what are those conditions under which people do well? And it turns out we've always known what they are, we've just forgotten them. Or rather, there's been a kind of political culture for the past 25, 30 years, which has required schools to act against their better instincts. And I think this is why it's so important, as Pedro said this morning, that we shouldn't be talking about reform, we should be talking about transformation. There's no point trying to fix this. We just need to change it and do something differently. Years ago, I was born in Liverpool. Did I say that? Well, I was. So, you know, I defy you to contradict me on that. I was, because I was there, that's the point. So, when I was in my early 20s, I went round an abattoir in Liverpool, you know, a slaughterhouse. A slaughterhouse, an abattoir, I can't remember now why I went, honestly. It's a long time ago. I think I was on a date. You know, I know how to please a woman, frankly. I mean, before we go to the restaurant, let's go and see where this all came from. You know, so you don't overorder. So I was going around this abattoir with a group of us. It's like a popular thing, you know, and with our tour guide. An abattoir is a factory that is designed specifically to kill animals. And they do. They are tremendously successful. Honestly, they're kind of infallible, to be honest. Very few escape and form survivors clubs and have annual reunions. You know, that was close, absolutely, you know. No, it works. And when I was going around this thing, at the far end of it, it's a bit of a grisly experience to have, but you should have it, by the way. If you've never been to an abattoir, you should go around. It will change your mind about a lot of things. It's like my wife's mother, she's from Ireland, as she was, and she always used to say, she wasn't being morbid, but she said, you should, at least once a month, you should go to a funeral. She wasn't being morbid. It was just like, just to remind you that this isn't forever. I think it's very important that we need a sense of perspective about how much time we have and, you know, and what we do with it. I'll come back to this in just a minute. But anyway, moving on from this cheery note of funerals and abattoirs for a moment. And another thing. No, as I went around this abattoir, there was a door at the far end and a sign on it that said veterinarian. And I was baffled, frankly, because I thought he must be depressed. Another fruitless day at work. With these animals failing to respond to all my attempts at revival. I said, why do you have a veterinarian in the abattoir? And he said, well, he comes and does random visits to do random autopsies on the animals. I said, well, he must have seen a pattern by now, surely. You know, this isn't CSI, is it? I mean, another 500 animals with bolts in their head. You know, there's something going on in here, and I'm going to get to the bottom of it. You know, this cannot be a coincidence. I said, but my point is this. If you design a system to do something, specifically, don't be surprised if it does it. And if you design a school system to do something in particular, don't be surprised if that's essentially what it does. Now, our systems are not designed to encourage the things we're all talking about. They were designed to do something else. They were designed to promote, I mean, saving Horace Mann, who did have a wonderful vision for education, but as they've evolved, and particularly as they've evolved in the past 50 years, they've turned into something else. They've turned into systems which celebrate conformity, compliance, and linearity. And we pathologize difference in our school systems. One of the ways we do it is we have a very narrow conception of ability in schools. You know, we think that human intelligence is a synonym for academic ability, and it's simply not. Academic ability is important, but it's not the whole of human intelligence by a very long way. But if you start out with a narrow conception of ability, you automatically generate a large conception of inability, or of disability, of people who need remedial help. It would be, wouldn't it, like running an entire national sports education system that was entirely focused on lacrosse or cricket. In fact, I rather like the sound of this now. But no, but seriously, if sport takes multiple forms and engages multiple areas of people's intelligence, physicality, and athleticism. But if you reduce it to one and said, look, the really important sport is lacrosse, or pick your own sport. And the people who are good at that are really the people we're looking for. They're the top performers. They're the smart ones. And you get the whole system to do that. And if you find people who aren't good at that, you can say, well, we do have remedial programs in baseball, in the high jump, in athletics. But the real people we're looking for are the lacrosse players. Well, that's what we've done in our school system, effectively. We have produced a narrow conception of the mind, and people who don't show it, don't have a capacity for it, don't have any enjoyment in it, are pathologized by the system. They become the problem. A lot of the work I know that Pedro and the team here is involved in is focusing on the school-to-prison pipeline, which is an outrageous aberration in our education systems. You see, the reason it's like an industrial system is industrial systems are focused on conformity and compliance and on producing certain types of things. And it's a feature of industrial systems, linear systems, that they produce waste products, products for which we cannot find a proper purpose or which are marginal to the intention of the system when it was designed. And we're doing that all the time in schools. There are people who don't make it, who don't get through the system, who aren't valued by the system, who are considered to be wasteful byproducts of the system. And they end up in all kinds of other places. Now, it's not, Pedro, I'm sure, will confirm this. It would be wrong to say if you leave high school early that you end up in jail. That's not true. What is true is a very high proportion of the people in the prison system left high school early and didn't graduate. It's roughly, as you look across the country, it's anything between 15 and 30% of kids don't complete high school. Actually, in some districts, it's more like 50%. Well, you can't at that point, I dislike the word dropout because it implies that kids have failed the system. With numbers like that, you can't tell yourself that anymore. You have to say the system failed them, don't you? Because kids want to learn, they just don't like the way they're being engaged or the fact they're not being engaged. So my work, and I think this conference is about this, I think it's what we're all been talking about, implicitly and explicitly, is what are these conditions under which people flourish? And can we make them a central part of how we educate everybody? There has been, for the past 20-odd years now, a concerted effort to raise standards in schools. It's global in character. It's been fueled by the league tables published by the OECD in Paris. And my friend Pasi Solberg from Finland refers to this as the Global Education Reform Movement, or GERM, for short. And it is infectious. All countries are doing it. America has thrown itself wholeheartedly, politically, into trying to improve its rankings in the international league tables in reading, math, and science. Billions of dollars have been spent in America to the commercial for-profit testing companies to come up with more and more tests to raise standards. It hasn't worked. It's greatly enriched the testing companies. It's done nothing to improve standards, graduation rates, engagement levels, or the motivation of teachers. In fact, on the contrary. It's a busted flush, and yet we keep doing it. Billions and billions of dollars every year. It's what we're hearing this morning about California. I came across this image recently. I'd just like to share it with you. Hang on, it's in my pocket. I want to show this image to show you that this presentation has been prepared. I have thought about this while I was streaming Pedro live this morning. Now, that's not an unusual image. You know that's the sort of thing that goes on. What's happened in the reform movement has been based on three big principles. The first of them is competition, in no big order. It's a very, very competitive system, particularly as it's been expressed here in America. Kids against kids, schools against schools, districts against districts, state against state. You know, the Obama administration who did lots of wonderful things, but in education, their signature initiative was called Race to the Top. All the rhetoric is about racing, competition, outperforming the competition. If we know anything about human life, it's what we're hearing from the community representatives this morning. Great communities, great schools, great families, great districts, great countries thrive on collaboration. Now, I'm not saying there's no room for competition, but human life is a collaborative enterprise. It's the only way it works. We are 7.5 billion people on this planet. We are intensely social creatures. Our knowledge is a densely woven, intricate fabric that we compose together. None of us knows more than a fraction of it. The whole system only works if we work together. And yet our education systems don't practice or preach. I mean, your school may, but politically you're not encouraged to practice or preach collaboration. The message of the system is it's about competition. Kids learn more than anything else from each other. Learning is a very social process, and yet in many of our schools, because of this competitive dynamic, children learn in groups, but not as groups. It astonishes me that people are going around saying, we've come across this new thing called project-based learning. What? When did that become a new thing? You know, when did participant research become a novelty? These things have been around forever. Montessori, as we're hearing from Chef Alice earlier, based their entire system on collaboration, kids working together, on the social character of learning. But instead, this is the message we get. Sooner or later, you're going to have to sit down and outperform other people, because all this is about getting people into college. Now, we can talk about that a bit later on if you like. I mean, I like colleges. I've worked in colleges. We're in a college. But not everybody has to go to college. There are other ways to have a fulfilling life rather than lining up and doing an academic degree. Plenty of good ways. But one of the results of this is that we have completely marginalized vocational programs in schools. All those things you used to do at school, shop, workshop activities, practical things with your hands, getting out and doing things, it's all gone in favor of this. The balance is completely shot here. But there's another way of, let me give you another version of this picture. I'm going to stand it on its head. I don't know how many of you have seen this picture before, but this was taken in the Indian state of Bihar. And it was about 2 years ago. It caused a furore in Bihar. Among politicians, among others, because, let me just explain what's happening here. This building is an examination center, and inside it are 10th graders who are taking a test which has a critical bearing on whether they progress to the next level of their education and what institution they may go to. The people scaling the walls are their parents, who are shoving cheat sheets through the window to help them pass the test. They're doing this because they feel the quality of teaching has been so low in Bihar that these kids don't have a fair crack of the whip. This is the equity argument. So their parents are doing what they can to give their kids an advantage. Of course, it corrupted the whole system. What you can't see are the dozens of people on the floor waiting to climb the wall when there's a space. Now, this is madness, isn't it? This is no way to run the education system of our young, but I show it to you not because it's some odd thing that just happened in Bihar. Although it doesn't look like this in America, we're doing the same thing. Now, our parents are literally being driven up the wall. And so are schools and teachers trying to keep pace with this increasingly intense mode of competition. And the point is, it doesn't have to be that way. And the other thing about this, of course, it's all to too little end. At the moment, there are 1.2 billion kids in the world, that's kids between the ages of 15 and 24. About 14% of them are unemployed, have never been in work, and feel they have no prospect of a job. It depends where you go. In America, youth unemployment runs at about 10%. It's about twice adult unemployment, typically. When there's a recession, it's the kids that get hit first, typically. In parts of the Mediterranean, the rate of youth unemployment is over 50%. Greece, that's true. Parts of Italy, that's true. So despite all this money being pumped into these systems, the very people it's meant to serve, which are people in business and the economy, are the ones who are being least served, in some respects, by the system. It's a very expensive failure. So the thing is that the system did work at some point, but this is the problem of reform. What's happening is that we're trying more and more to make the old system work, putting more resource into it, trying to make it more efficient. But if the system's designed to do the wrong thing, it doesn't matter how efficient it gets, it'll still do the wrong thing. So my argument is that we have to rethink how it works. So one of the issues is competition. We need collaboration. Another is that education is based on standardization. Human life isn't. Human life is based on the opposite principle of diversity. Can I ask you, how many of you here have got children? Okay. How about 2 children or more? Right. And the rest of you have seen such children? Small people wandering around. Okay. Well, I will make you a bet which I will win. If you've got 2 children or more, I bet you they are completely different from each other, aren't they? You would never confuse them, would you? Like, which one of you remind me? Yeah, your father and I are constantly being baffled at breakfast, you know, so I have a simple system of badges. The point is, every human life is different. A few years ago, I was at a peace summit in Vancouver. It was called the Vancouver Peace Summit. They're very good at titles in Canada, that's what we've discovered. So the opening session was called World Peace Through Personal Peace. And I was hosting it. We had an hour to sort that out. We were just killing time for the final 20 minutes ready. But there were 10 people on the panel, one of whom was the Dalai Lama. He was the guest of honor. So I had to introduce the Dalai Lama. Pedro had to introduce me. I had to introduce the Dalai Lama. You know, but then I thought, I don't really have to introduce him, do I? Because I thought anyone whose name starts with "the," you know, you've arrived socially, haven't you, really? You can relax in most settings, really. Sorry, which Dalai Lama are you? That'd be "the." So he was asked all kinds of great things, and he's a wonderful, wonderful man. But he said a couple of things I just want to tell you about. One was, he said, to be born at all is a miracle. So what are you going to do with your life? It's such a simple question, but such an important one. You know, can I ask you, how many human beings do you think have ever lived? I don't mean prehistoric creatures who went around on their knuckles. You know, I'm talking about people like us. You know, groovy people. You know, attractive people. You know, with attractive profiles and you know, and a sense of irony. So, how many of us do you think there have been? Now, I'll give you a clue. The Earth has been around for about 4.5 billion years, so far as we know. I mean, there are some people in the Midwest who doubt this, but I think all the body of evidence is against them. Human beings like us, we've been cooking a long time, but we have, in this form, this exquisite form that you see before you, this form, like this final word of nature form, that's what we're talking about. We evolved about, people disagree, 150 to 200,000 years ago. Let's say 200,000. How many of us do you think there have been? Human beings like you and me, with our sensibilities, our capacities for language, our forms of intelligence, our this sort of physical configuration, walking upright, binocular vision, you know, us, you know what we're like. Us. Modern human beings. How many of us do you think there have been in the past 150,000 to 200,000 years? Thank you so much. That's great. That's my point. A lot. No, go on. Give me a number. 10 billion, thank you. 40 billion, thank you. Do I hear 50? 50, thank you. 50's the lady. 50's the lady at the front. 75, thank you. 75 people. There are 400 here now. Okay, let me tell you, because time's short. Nobody knows, okay? No, I mean, not for certain. But people have tried to calculate it. Serious statisticians have tried to figure this out. And what they've figured out is that over the course of the history of modern humanity, it's estimated that somewhere between 80 and 120 billion people have lived. So let's cut the difference. Say 100 billion. Most people would go with that as a number. About 100 billion people. Now, the point is, every one of those lives has been unique, unrepeatable, different, and unto itself. Nobody's had your life before. Nobody's been born with your sensibilities, your particular mix of talents and characteristics and genetic predispositions. Nobody, not your parents, not your twin, nobody. Every life is one-off. And to be here at all, as Adele said, is a miracle. Every child in your class, every kid in the LAUSD school system is one-off, unrepeatable, unto themselves. Diversity is the hallmark of human life, just as it is the rest of life on Earth. The planet thrives on diversity. And our big mistake is to try and impose conformity on top of it, because it automatically pathologizes difference of every sort, of gender, of race, of ethnicity, of faith, you name it. Human life is as intensely diverse as every other form of life on Earth, plants, flora, and fauna. The other thing is, he said, by the way, he was asked a question, and it took him a very long time to think about it. And I was a bit disturbed because I was chairing the session. You know, I wondered if he'd kind of drifted off, you know. And I can't remember what the question was now, but he closed his eyes and got very thoughtful for a while. And I think it was a question about philanthropy, but we're all sitting thinking, this is going to be great. And then he leant forward, opened his eyes, and he said, and I thought, this is it. And he said, I don't know. And I thought, what do you mean you don't know? You're the Dalai Lama. You know, we don't know. You know, but you have the definite article in your name. So he said, what is it? He said, I've never thought about that. What do you think? To the room. Now, the reason I mention that is because it illustrates something important, to me anyway. One is that here is one of the world's greatest teachers, the leader of one of the world's oldest, most profound wisdom traditions, perfectly comfortable saying, I don't know. And why doesn't he know? Because nobody can know everything. It was outside of experience. It's not something he'd thought about. He didn't think he could find out on Google. He thought, I don't know. And because nobody can know everything. And it's perfectly fine to say you don't know. It's fine as a teacher to say you don't know to your students, because they may well know something that you don't. And that was the second part of his point. He said, what do you think? And what it simply illustrates is that the world's great teachers are also great students. Learning is a conversation. It's not a monologue saving what's happening right now, but it's a conversation. We learn collectively. So we have systems which are based on standardization rather than on diversity. But our systems are also based on the idea of division rather than on synergy. No, we separate the arts and the sciences. We separate elementary schools from kindergarten. We separate elementary from high schools. We separate teachers from each other. We separate schools in the districts. But synergy is how life works. It's what the whole principle of ecological development is. Ecosystems work by the mutual enrichment of their various parts. But we have schools which are run separately. So one of the effects of compliance is, as Pedro was saying earlier, the arts get pushed out. The sciences get pushed to the front. Now, the sciences are deeply important, but they're not more important than the humanities. They're not more important than literature. They're not more important than physical education. They're important. But because we have this divisive system of thinking about schools politically, the effect is that we push things to one side and marginalize things that matter just as much. And then I get politicians saying to me all the time, no, we have these problems of disaffection, disengagement, low graduation rate. How do we solve them? And I'm not being facetious to say, stop causing them. Because if you stop doing that, the problem would go away. And it actually does. That's what happens in alternative schools. It's what happened in the Harlem Children's District. It's what happens when people gather together in the community. Something was being said this morning. Empower the community, get parents involved, work with them collaboratively, push back on these restraints, change the model, and the problems aren't so much solved. They evaporate. They get replaced by something much richer. And I want to give you a couple of quick examples of that before we're done. As Pedro said, a lot of people know the work I do, in part because of these TED Talks. You know, I gave one in 2006, the first one. And it became very popular in, I think, in about 160 countries. When I say I think, I know for a fact. You know, obviously. And, and the first one's been downloaded, oh, I don't know, roughly, what would it be? 47,500,000, no. No, but it's a short talk on creativity and how kids are creative. That's not an earth-shattering thing to have to say. The kids are naturally creative. But here's the thing. There is a difference between education, between learning, education, and school. And it's an important difference to dwell on. Learning is the natural process of acquiring new skills and understanding. Human beings are intensely curious. We are the most curious species ever to walk the earth, so far as we know. We are also driven by a set of powers which, so far as we can judge, are unique to us in their quality and range. There's one way of describing it, but it's not a single power, it's a multiple set of capabilities. But the way I think of it is the term imagination. Human beings are gifted with profound powers of imagination. And we marginalize it and take it for granted. But if you think of it, imagination is the root of everything distinctively human. Imagination is the ability to bring into mind things that aren't present to our senses. With imagination, you can anticipate the future. You can't predict it always, not with people or living creatures. You can in the physical world, not so much with people. With imagination, you can visit the past, or you can reappraise the past, you can reframe the past. With imagination, you can step outside the present moment and see the world as other people might. It's the seat of empathy. But this power to bring to mind things that aren't present is deeply potent in human culture, because from it flow a whole set of other capacities that we call creativity. I mean, creativity is really putting your imagination to work. It's materializing your ideas, bringing them into being. And it could be in any form whatever, but creativity is a very practical process that involves using media. There could be numbers, it could be clay, it could be steel, it could be fabric. This whole building began in somebody's imagination and became a collective enterprise of craft, skill, design, applied thought, and the manipulation of materials and space. One of the best examples I can think of collective, collaborative creativity was the moonshot. Do you remember in 61 when President Kennedy said, by the end of the decade, we're going to put a man on the moon? It was a man. And 1968, it happened. It involved thousands of institutions, hundreds of thousands of people working in dozens of disciplines around the world to make that happen. But it happened through a massive effort of collaboration driven by a single vision. And what interests me about it was, although they were daunted by the objective, they didn't try to negotiate the objective. You know, I mean, they didn't say, look, Mr. President, this is great, but could we move the moon a bit closer? Because it's like really far. If we could just like halve it, that would be great. You know, the objective is what it is. And I think we have a similar challenge in front of us, the transformation of the life chances of our children through the transformation of schools. It will be a massive collaborative effort. It needs a unifying single vision. It needs a common set of principles. It needs people working together in all their disciplines and all their capacities, parents, teachers, whoever they happen to be. But it can be done because we created the system in the first place, and so we can recreate the system if we choose to do that. But this power of imagination and creativity is what is at the heart of human achievement in the arts, in the sciences, in technology, in every field. It's not unique to the arts. It takes particular turns in the arts, but it's in every part of human life. We live in a veil of conceptions that we create together as we work together to frame our understanding of the world. And the drive here, I think, we have to recognize firstly, say that children are born with these powers and they love to learn. Human beings are intensely creative and very curious. Kids don't all like being educated, and many of them have a big problem with school. But the problem is school. It's not the kids. We don't need to fix the kids, we need to fix school. Let me give you an example. I've got 2 kids, and like most kids, by the age of 2-ish, you know, they were learning to speak. Your children probably learned to speak around the age of 2-ish, thereabouts. Depends. All children do. And the interesting thing about this is that if you're a parent, you didn't teach your child to speak, did you? You didn't because you couldn't. They taught themselves. You didn't because you couldn't, because you don't know how you do it either. You know, there didn't come a point, did there, when your child was 18 months old, where you sat them down and say, look, we need to talk. you know, or more specifically, you do. And just to pin this right down. And this is how it works. You know, you probably noticed your father and I making all these noises for the past 18 months. I know it's rather baffling, but these noises make sense to us. Some of them are the names of things. We call them nouns, and there'll be about 5,000 of them you'll need to learn before you start school. There are other noises we make which aren't the names of things. They're names of things we do with things. They're verbs. And if you change your tone of voice at the end particularly, you can indicate whether you have done something or whether you're going to do something. There'll be about 5,000 of those for you to learn as well. And don't worry about the subjunctive. Nobody gets it. Honestly, it's fine. You can fathom that out later on. It doesn't happen. You don't teach your child to speak. Your child learns to speak because she wants to and she can. And they take it in through their skin, through the culture. They learn it socially. Kids love learning until they get going through school. And then gradually they start to lose interest in it. It's not your fault as a teacher necessarily at all. It's the system in which it all operates. What Pedro was talking about earlier. Chopping the day up into bits and pieces, ringing bells, dividing things away, making them sit down. All the conditions under which you would not choose to learn yourself and didn't when you were younger either. So my point is this system can, with an effort of will and a concerted and collective vision, can be transformed, and it has to be transformed for our children's sake, for our communities, and for the larger existential challenge that we face collectively. And when I say it can be, I'm going to show you a very quick video just to illustrate it. But when I said a lot of people know me through the TED Talks, it's very nice. But you know, I've spent my whole life in education. I wasn't invented at TED, you know. And no, I was at a conference a few years ago in the Midwest, and I was there to talk to all the students. And one of the faculty said to me, "You've been at this a long time, haven't you?" I said, "What's that?" And he said, "Trying to transform education." I said, "I have, yeah." He said, "What is it, 7 years now?" I said, 7 years, how do you mean? He said, "You know, since that TED Talk." I said, "Yes, but I was alive before that." You know, that was like a thing, you know. I just showed up. I'm glad it went well, you know, but when I did the first one, I didn't know it was going to go online, even. You know, it's gone on to be seen all these times. But, I mean, if I'd known, for example, I tell a story in that talk about my son's girlfriend. You know, take another look at it, you know, but if I'd known it was going to go viral around the planet, I might not have used our real name. No, I'm just saying. I'm still expecting this text message to arrive from this woman. I showed that talk to my wife. I said, "What do you think of it?" She said, "It's all right." She said, "I wish you'd worn a different shirt." I said, "Thank you, thank you." All right. Anyway, so I published this book a few years ago because of that, because people said, "Okay, well, that's the problem. What do you do about it?" So this book is an attempt to set out the principles on which the transformation can happen. This isn't something I've invented. I stand, as you all do, in a very long tradition. We have to fight this amnesia problem. There have been people laboring, arguing, figuring out how to do school better since the time we first had schools. Back to the Greeks and beyond that. In all parts of the world, people have had, there is a deep history, and in the last 200 years particularly, there have been concerted efforts in every part of this country to apply the proper principles of holistic education and the conditions under which children will thrive in school districts around the country. There's a massive and honourable repertory of research and practice for you all to draw from. You are not isolated pioneers. You stand in a very long tradition. So I've tried in there to say a bit about it, but the thing at the bottom is the grassroots revolution is important. Somebody said this morning that the change will come from the ground up. All change comes from the ground up. No matter how bad it may seem temporarily with the people at the top. Real social change, cultural change happens from the ground up. It's a grassroots movement. I mean, for example, I was born in 1950, and I lived through the 1960s. I was a teenager in the 1960s. I lived through the sexual revolution, as you can see. And I missed it, as it turns out. I didn't go out that weekend, but I read about it later on. It seemed to have been a fantastic time. But at the height of the sexual revolution, people writhing around in the streets uncontrollably. It's exhausting. It doesn't last long, that type of thing, honestly. It fizzles out within an hour or two. But while all that was going on, Nobody, when feminism was in its first, well, I should say its second big movement after the suffragettes in the 60s and 70s, nobody was discussing same-sex marriage. It was not on the cards, it wasn't on the table, it wasn't up for debate. It was still a criminal act in many parts of the world. I know it is still in a few. What interests me is that over the past few years, every state in the union here has passed legislation to approve same-sex marriage. Yeah, like, of course, can we just get on with that and do that? It's been largely uncontroversial. I mean, there have been pockets of controversy, but most people say that's fine. That's such a huge shift. And it happened without anybody specifically being responsible for it. I mean, there have been key people, key campaigns, Harvey Milk, the Rainbow Coalition's been lots of things. Ellen has been a major influence, I'm sure, in changing the minds of people in Middle America about maybe this is okay. Will and Grace, somebody talked about recently. There have been things in the popular culture, but these weren't designed to do that. These came out of the shift in the popular culture. The reason I'm saying it is, this shift, which most people now accept, which is a big strand of the diversity argument, did not happen because members of Congress went on a retreat in Aspen, where they spent the weekend deciding this was an issue they had to go back and sell to their voters. It was too long coming, and we have to go back and tell people what the right thing is. It happened because the voters told them they wanted it to happen. And you've got to remember, most politicians have a very short shelf life. They're there for 2 or 3 years. I mean, some people last a lot longer than that in their political life, but the shift happens from the ground up, and that's my point. When people say, how do we change the education system, don't wait for anybody to do it. You are the system. We're all the system. We're it. If you're a teacher for the children in your school, you are the education system. When you close the door, if there is a door on your classroom, what you do next is the education system. If you're a head teacher, when you stand up in front of all your teachers and kids on a Monday morning, you are the system, and what you do next is the system. And there's a lot more room for innovation in the system than people believe there to be. There are 2 big constraints on the education system. One is the political culture, which bears down on schools, but the other is the habits of mind, which keep the system in place within the schools. Most of the things that will go on in schools don't have to happen. I mean, when I say there's a difference between learning, education, and school, learning is natural, education is a formal process of learning, an organized system. A school is a community of learners. That's it. It's a community of learners. And how schools are organized is it up to the people who run them. So let me just show this quick video. Are you moving into position to get me off the tape? What happened? Pedro, you said I had till 7 o'clock. Oh, let me explain what this is. You see what Pedro's done now? This is the problem with this center, frankly. Interference at the top. Pedro has to go. You know what I'm saying. We need a popular leader. Won't be long. What? Do you have to finish now? It's too late, Pedro. It's over. This whole Pedro thing's not working for me. I don't know about you. But I saw this. Does anybody here speak Dutch? Doesn't matter. Nor do I. This is something that's on Dutch television. This is a puzzle. See if you can solve it. People were invited to go into this room and solve this problem. In the room, there's a table. On the table, there's a plastic tube. And at the bottom of the tube, there's a peanut. They have to get the peanut out of the tube. That's it. See if you do it before they do. Oh, the table is bolted to the floor. The tube is bolted to the table. That's not it. who got it? All right. I didn't when I first saw it, but look, I'll tell you. Most people don't get that. The ape got it. So there's hope. You know, there is a plan B. That's what I'm saying. But here's the thing. Everything those people needed to solve the problem was in the room. All the resources they needed were right there. The people who solved it saw the resource that was available to them and made use of it. The people who didn't include the resources in their framing of the problem or the solution. I'm sure many people went in, they saw this bottle of water at the back with a little bowl of fruit, because it was at the back with a bowl of fruit, and thought, that's very nice, these people. I don't have time for that right now, I've got to solve this problem. The people who solved it made use of everything that was available to them. The thing is, can you imagine anybody failing to solve the problem if they'd gone in and the water bottle had been right next to the tube? They just wouldn't automatically think, oh, that's easy, straightforward, with a few exceptions. And that's my point as well, that we have all the resources we need to solve the problem. We've got teachers, parents, kids, and cultural organizations and goodwill everywhere. We need to get everybody involved in restoring the culture of our schools. Human resources, yours, your kids, the parents, human resources are just like the Earth's natural resources. They're very diverse. They're often hidden. You have to go digging for them. Children's talents, any more than your talents, don't immediately show themselves unless there's the opportunity. It's why you need a broad curriculum. And when you've discovered them, you have to refine them and do something with them to find out their real value and purpose. And what this leads to for me is to say that the analogy with education and industrialism is not so much with manufacturing. The real analogy is with industrial agriculture. Because industrial agriculture grew up at the same time as industrial manufacturing in the 18th and 19th centuries. The analogy is perfect because they're dealing with living systems. Industrial agriculture revolutionized the way we produced living things, plants, and how we raised animals. Industrial agriculture was based on 3 innovations. The first of them was mechanization, which made it possible to till huge areas of land simultaneously. Let me just show you a quick image of this. The stuff I'm not going to show you here. Don't worry about this. Forget that. It really doesn't matter. Don't even worry about it.
It was...
No, we don't want you. This is an image to me of industrial agriculture. Now, it's a harsh image, but all across the world, this is what we've been doing with the land. This planet is covered by a very thin smear of soil, and we depend upon it. And I say it's taken billions of years to get to where it is. The Earth, until we got to grips with industrial agriculture, was a scene of massive natural diversity. In the past 300 years, we have come collectively, as a species, there are now 7.5 billion of us on the planet, and we're heading for 9 billion by the end of it. That's almost 10% of all human beings who've ever lived on the Earth right now, the biggest generation by far in the whole of human history. We have come, through these processes, to depend on about 11 plant species to sustain the population of the planet. You know, corn, maize, you can name them, potatoes, rice. But there are literally tens, probably hundreds of thousands of other species that we've discarded, pushed to one side in the mania to depend upon these sorts of crops. Along the way, we have brought ourselves to the brink of what's called the 6th extinction. We've also come to depend not just on 11 forms of plant, but on about 5 animals. I don't mean 5 individual animals. I mean, that'd be a big pressure on them, wouldn't it? 5 species of animal, largely, among the countless thousands of species of animals that were on the planet, living their lives comfortably until we got to grips with all this. We're now, say, on the edge of the 6th great extinction, caused, as far as we can tell, by human activity in the preoccupation with this sort of way of living. In the past 10 years, we have lost something like 75% of the biomass of flying insects around the world, on which we depend for the propagation of plants and our own survival. And no amount of apps on the iPhone will solve that. This is a catastrophe in the natural world that we're fomenting. But it's based on this form of industrial agriculture, which, as you can see, is intensely unnatural. It's based on mechanization, which meant you could grow monocrops as far as the eye could see. The second innovation was chemical fertilizer, because the emphasis in industrial agriculture is on yield and output, more, bigger. And chemical fertilizers force things to grow more quickly. We're doing exactly the same thing with animals, by the way. This is a not unfamiliar feature in how we're dealing with animals currently. Warehousing them as if they were inanimate objects. And the third innovation has been chemical pesticides, because natural ecosystems protect themselves. They have their own forms of immunity, and they protect each other. If you separate them out and put them in great open fields and destroy the ecosystem, then they're prey to all kinds of blights and problems, which is Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. Now, the thing is, I know it's a complex area, this, but industrial agriculture has been focused on yield, and it's been very successful. But, in terms of yield, but it's destroying ecosystems, it's polluting waterways and rivers and oceans, and it's eroding soils which are being washed away at prodigious rates all around the planet. This is stuff we depend upon. And the reason is that industrial agriculture has been focused on the plant and on size and yield. Organic agriculture is based on a different principle. Organic agriculture is based on natural processes of growth and development, and organic sustainable farmers, which is what Chef Alice was talking about earlier, know something different. If you want to really increase output in a healthy environment and for it to be sustainable, not short term, not to bankrupt the planet, you don't focus on the plant, you focus on the soil. If you get the soil right, you can grow things in perpetuity. If you follow natural cycles of growth and development and composting, the soil will be rich and it will sustain us, as far as we know, in perpetuity. That's the whole movement towards sustainable and organic agriculture. Well, so this is how people tend to think of the core purpose of organic agriculture. Get the soil right. We depend upon that. And the plant will take care of itself. Create good conditions and things will grow. We've done the same thing, I think, with education. We have been focused for the past 20, 30 years on output and yield, graduation rates, league tables, competition. And along the way, we've neglected the conditions under which people naturally learn and want to learn. And along the way, we've eroded the culture of education, the diversity of that culture, the values under which people flourish best. That culture depends on diversity of learning. We need the arts, we need the sciences, we need physical education. We need people to get up and run around, but they need to play. Their children are growing physically, emotionally, spiritually, as well as cognitively. We have to attend to them holistically. There's an ecosystem of learners and teachers and students and parents and cultural groups. If we get that mix right, it happens every time. If we get the rich culture in the school where it should be, growth and learning happens automatically. Achievement levels go up. They always do. They tend to decline when we forget the culture of the school and make it barren and sterile. I think it's an absolutely existential challenge for us just now. We are 7.5 billion people heading for 9 billion. The Vice Chancellor said this morning, quoting H.G. Wells, education is a race between civilization and catastrophe. It is. I'm optimistic we can do this, but I think we should never underestimate the importance and power of education in restoring these conditions to our communities and to our children. It's probably never been more important than it is now. And if sometimes you feel marginalized in education, don't forget that you're doing the most important work anybody could do, creating the conditions for the growth and well-being and safety of our children. You know, when you look at a plant grow, it does seem miraculous that something from a small seed will grow into this luxurious being. Education's like that. There have been lots of examples during the day. If you create conditions for growth, people who are otherwise written off flower, flourish, and become themselves. They lead entirely different lives, which are more purposeful for them and more fulfilling for the people they're associated with. But, you know, just like in the natural world, if you say it's a miracle, it sounds like it's a one-off and it's unusual. But in the natural world, miracles are commonplace. And it's true in schools. If you get the conditions right, miracles happen every day. And they do. They're happening here in this city. And our job is to make more of them. We need more miracles and as many as we can. Because if you're in education, you're in the miracle business. And it's the only business, really, I think, that we should be in. Thank you very much.
One more time for Sir Ken Robinson. Let's get the conditions right. Thank you, Ken. So, again, I'm hoping that as you're listening, you're thinking about your work in the communities and schools you're in and how to take these ideas. I was very impressed by Ken's optimism that we just have to stop doing the bad things to begin doing some of the good things and get those conditions right. Part of those conditions are political, because as we know, politics drives a lot of what is possible in education. And so to help us in thinking about how to engage in the policy arena, we've invited the Honorable Joyce Elliott, State Senator from Arkansas, who also happens to have been a teacher for many years. And we've asked her to join us because she's had some experience working with policymakers and has some thoughts about how do we begin to shift the direction of education and move the policymakers to get out of the way. Honorable Joyce Elliott.
Thank you and good afternoon. I was afraid by this time of day that if I didn't have pictures, you would not even look my way. So that's why I'm using pictures pretty much to prompt myself. But I am a politician. I say that out loud because I want people to get used to the idea that being a politician is a good thing. But I also am a teacher. I taught school for 30 years. And I say that out loud for the exact same reason, because too many people think being a teacher is not a good thing and discourage their kids from being teachers. And likewise, discourage their kids from being politicians. And for every teacher out there, you need to run for office if you don't like what's going on. You really need to think about this. Because teachers, teachers said it when I was teaching, just let me go into my classroom and close my door and leave me alone. Well, that's not working out for us so well now, is it? Because what's happened to us is because of politics. And since I am the mutant of both of those, I thought I'd share with you today through pictures and commentary what I think all of this means for transforming education. Because I have been on a transformative path for a very long time, having grown up in Arkansas. That's my little town. You might think of Arkansas as a little state, and I've even had somebody ask me in an airport about Arkansas. Now, what state is that in? I go, okay, we need to work on education here, people. But Arkansas is a small state. It's a state in the South. It's a state that so many people left when I was growing up. But I decided, because things were changing, Ken Robinson and I could have shared, I guess, that whole love child thing in the 60s, because we're approximately the same age. We just didn't meet. But so, and now we have, so what? But the thing of it is, in Arkansas, it was tough. We were going through integrating schools. I was one of those kids integrating a school. And when I did, when I had that opportunity, and when I had that challenge of doing that, I knew there was really something wrong with the way we were doing school. Because I'd been to an all-black school for up through the 9th grade. And my school was good. The things that we mentioned, that we talked about, we played and we did lots of things. But because the schools were separated, and this was a political, social decision that we made, and because those schools were separated, I thought there surely had to be something so much better in that other school, where I was not allowed to go in Willisville, population 188. However, when I was there, it was 209, so we were a metropolitan city then. But when I did go to this other school, and I found out it wasn't even as good as the school I was in, I didn't know what the words were necessarily, but I knew there was something vastly wrong with what we were doing. So that is really kind of the thing that set me on this whole thing about transformation. Will it go forward? Oh, there we go. So I have just spent my life thinking about what I can do with kids like this. How can I empower kids to be a part of this change that we need? That is a picture inside the Capitol on the Senate floor. When kids come to the Capitol, especially from my district, I love to take them inside the Capitol so they will know this is their building as well. And when you look at those kids, you might well know these are not the kids from the most well-heeled parts of Little Rock, Arkansas. But I want them to feel the power just like as I want their parents to feel the power if we're going to transform schools. And oftentimes, this is their first trip to the Capitol. They're not really sure why we're sitting on the floor, but I tell their teachers to tell them later and make sure they understand. This is another picture from the Capitol. This is the day we were holding a ceremony to honor Dr. Martin Luther King's birthday, where we had kids in the Capitol talking to us about what their dreams are about school. And it's important to hear their dreams and to hear their ideas about what they want to have happen in their worlds. And this little girl there were many of them who were good, but she was just so spectacular. She'll be glad to know she was at UCLA. That little girl right there is my granddaughter. She is 6 years old and as fierce as they come. But one thing she knows for sure is that she has people supporting her. She goes to a school where almost everybody in that school is black or brown, a few white kids. She could be someplace else. But it just so happens her family, her extended family, and all of us don't believe it's in the interest of everybody to run away from the school where she is, when we know she's going to be okay because all of us are there. And if anything transformative is going to happen and be sustained in our schools, it's the responsibility of politicians and parents and grandparents like me to remain there, not run away, which is the very same reason I chose not to run away from Arkansas. Is there another Southerner in the room today? Am I it? Well, there was somebody here from Miami at one point, so that was kind of encouraging. Ken Robinson mentioned PISA and what's happening in all of these other countries. So as a legislator, as a liberal Democrat, and yeah, they do happen in Arkansas, we're there. And I do own this in Arkansas. I've been referred to in Arkansas as a last standing liberal. That might have some validity. But what we decided to do, the PISA scores came out, and everybody's talking about the PISA scores. This was in 2012. And you have legislators, everybody in here does. So your legislator, whether it's a senator or a representative, is a member of something called the National Conference of State Legislatures. Everyone is a member. We have education committees and committees on judiciary, just as we do kind of set up back in our states. So when the results came out in 2012 and there was all this discussion about it, I happened to be the chair along with a Republican friend of that committee. And so we talked the national conference into and made a proposal to them. Let's take a look at what these other high-performing countries are doing, and so that when we talk to our own colleagues about what's happening in other countries that we might could learn from, we will have a study, because whether they're going to read them or not, legislators like to have studies. So we took almost 18 months taking a look at the 10 highest performers then according to PISA. And our notion was to find out, not for them to tell us what to do, but are there some things they're doing in common across those 10 highest performers? Not that we had to do everything we found out, because we decided we were going to report only those things we found in common across all 10. So somebody asked this morning about research. So the research is out there. difficult to get anybody to do anything about it, but these will be the same people who will tell you we need to compete on the world stage. It's a report that is written to be accessible to educators, but most especially to legislators, because we know we're not going to read a great deal of everything. This is Central High School. I commend that report to you. It's easy to read. This is Central High School, which played a big part and still plays a big part in my unrelenting desire for transformation. That school was built in 1927. We were talking about creativity, and somebody had a notion of what that school would look like. It was called the most beautiful school in the country when it was built. And some of you might not know the history of Central High School, but you need to if you're going to understand where we've been and how we need to get to where we are trying to go. Because in 1954, you probably know about Brown versus Topeka. 1954, no, we're not kidding. You have to integrate schools and other places. Central High School became ground zero. I was starting first grade when the attempt was made in 1957 for the school to be integrated. And rather than say we're going to integrate these schools, then the governor and others decided that we will just have soldiers here and keep the black kids out who were trying to integrate these schools. It's been a long road for Central High School and integration in the South that has had ripple effects every place else. In September of this year, toward the end of the month, Central High School had a commemoration for the 60th anniversary of that attempt. 60 years ago, when kids were turned away, and that is not the slide I want, but, oh, that's my granddaughter right there, straight out of pre-K. These are kind of out of order, so I'll find them. She will be so pleased that I did that, but not quite so much. But it was 60 years ago today, and I can talk you through the rest of this. It was 60 years ago today when Central was attempted to be integrated. And so those students were turned away, and then we were commemorating today, on this day, what happened, and looking at the progress, and what else do we have to do? And the progress was not much to talk about when you think about where we are. Because as we sit here today, the State Board of Education in Arkansas is contemplating whether or not it is going to return that school to the people of Little Rock, Arkansas, because it's under state control. That's how much progress that has not been made. That's been the journey I've traveled to get to where I am now, to think about communities as transformative vehicles, not just schools. Communities have to be what's transformed, I believe, because I have yet to see a school that has had a great track record, transformed, really reformed for a few years, but inevitably it goes back to what it was when we don't have the community commitment. I don't know how they voted today. I haven't even decided to look. I didn't want to know before I talked to you because I didn't want to cry in front of you if they said no. So that's happened in this whole effort of getting toward doing something that's right for education. But as a politician, I decided, since we've chosen testing over educating, what can I do as a policymaker to try to put some policies in place to make sure education is returned to people who know what to do with it when they have it? I taught for 30 years, and I still miss teaching because I got to do what I wanted to and needed to as a teacher. And sometimes just because I said that doesn't make sense, I'm not doing it. You have to have in your gut and in your brilliance as a teacher, you have to have the capacity and you have to have the confidence that you are the professional here. And you have to act on it. But I know for a lot of educators, that's difficult to do, and it's frightening, especially when you think about the politics of it all. So I introduced legislation. I work with the ASCD, the Association for Supervision and Curriculum Development, because they started this whole child, whole community initiative. And I started working with them and looking at what they were doing in 2008. So when I went to the Senate in 2009, I knew this had to be a gradual process, because my idea is we're going to become whole child, whole community places. I was able to get a resolution passed. That's not as hard to do, but it's a way of starting a conversation. That was in 2009. So 2011, we were still talking about this some. 2013, I introduced legislation because I had this idea that if we are going to hold people accountable, I think we need to widen that sphere of people that we're holding accountable. And some of the people I wanted to hold accountable were people who look like me, like as you are part of the report card as well. It was the hardest thing in the world to do, because one person even said to me, I was trying to turn our schools into communist places, and that I was trying to take kids. But the legislation basically was about setting up a mechanism by which we could give communities the information it takes to become a whole school, whole community place. So if it were about the whole community, these are the things that were in the bill. We're going to set these things up that if you guarantee that kids have all of this, then they're probably going to be okay. And these were the tenets that were, you don't need to try to read that, so just look up here. You just look up here, because I gave up on that. These were the tenets, though, that if we are going to be a whole child, whole community, these are the things that would need to be true in your community. They've changed a bit now because ASCD has changed them some. But here's what we incorporated. If every child in the community had healthy options, if every child were safe, had active engagement, had adult support, didn't have to be their parents, had an intellectually stimulating environment. If they had these things, these would be the core tenets of what it would mean for a child, not to have to depend on everything to happen at the school, but it would happen in the community as well. Be a whole child, whole community. Now, who's going to be accountable for this? Start out with educators, parents, community members, and everybody was happy so far, because listen to this list. Everybody is okay if it's educators. Everybody is okay if it's parents in most cases. And community members was left broad because I wanted to be all kind of community members. But the last one I put on the list was policymakers, that we would be held accountable to. That is, if we had not done what we should do, elected or appointed, then people would know that too, and we could improve ourselves. And we almost had this made, and we thought we were about to get to the point we were going to have this mechanism for doing this, and it just didn't work out. And I think mainly because of political reasons I can't go into because we're short on time. But I think it can be done. And I know it won't be done within the political arena unless you get involved, because what I lacked, what I needed, was not just that I had the idea. I needed educators. I needed parents. I needed communities supporting me, because it cannot happen if it's just going to be one or two politicians who have the idea and even get legislation passed. After that, I even went so far to get a bill passed called Schools of Innovation or Districts of Innovation, because I knew if we were going to have a whole child, whole community, we needed to have people have the opportunity to not be held to just what we wanted them to do as politicians, but what the bill allowed people to do. was just, as we say in the South, bust open and use all of your great creativity and create this kind of school you want and not be bound by politics. And because there were other ideologues and more money who didn't necessarily like that, the next thing you know, we have a bill that's passed that undercut that as well. So if we want whole childs, whole communities, and I think we must have them. The thing that might seem obvious about that, if we want them, we have to act as whole communities to get them. Every politician is not there to make your life awful. Most of the time, they make bad decisions because you don't step up and tell us what the good decisions are. And that's important for you to remember. You have to get involved in politics. If nothing else, run for office and join people like me. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Senator Elliott. And Senator Elliott, actually, I'm going to have you come on back to the stage for the panel discussion. Yeah, come on back. All right, so to moderate and to build on what Senator Elliott shared in her very personal story, and thank you, Senator Elliott, for making the trip. Don't feel like, I guess, the only Southerner in the room. But so on that note, there are people online. We are live streaming today's event at transformschools.ucla.edu. I know a lot of folks are interested in Sir Ken's presentation. It's all live. We're going to keep the content. And PowerPoints as well. People have asked about that, so we'll have it all live. It'll be all up on our website. Lunch with Chef Alice Waters was live streamed as well. Thank you to the crew in the back that's been here since very early this morning filming today's conference. So joining us on the stage, our moderator who's standing behind me is John Rogers, who's a professor here in the Graduate School of Education and Information Studies at UCLA. And joining John is Dr. Eugene Garcia, Professor Emeritus at ASU, Dr. Sylvia Rousseau, Professor of Clinical Education at USC, and Dr. David Kerp, who's a professor of the Graduate School at UC Berkeley and a New York Times contributor. Welcome, John, and thank you for moderating today's conversation.
Thank you, Joe. Appreciate it. Thank you. I'm very excited to be here with this wonderful panel to develop further these ideas of what a policy framework needs to look like to support whole children and whole communities. And as the senator was saying, how we think about a politics that can emerge that will support that sort of policy framework. So let me begin with Dr. Garcia. If you could speak a little bit about what sorts of policy changes are necessary to support the potential of English learners.
Sure. It's a pleasure to be here. Nice visiting from both Arizona. It's always good to come back. And I can actually say buenas tardes to you all here. Spanish is now legal in California, thanks to Proposition 58. 70% of you said it's okay to be bilingual. Isn't that wonderful? Wasn't like that about 10 or 15 years ago when I was at Berkeley. So congratulations to you all for recognizing the significance of languages other than English in California. Clearly, the population of students who come to school not speaking English have been a focus of policy for now 60 years. So thanks to Lau versus Nichols in the San Francisco area, and then other judicial decisions, along with civil rights movement, the proposition that these students must be treated differently has been significant over the 60 years. So policy counts for these kids. It's important to understand that demography also counts. They are now a significant population, not just in California, but nationally. About 26% of moms who gave birth to babies in 2016 spoke a language other than English in the United States. Many of those moms will essentially teach their children their primary language first before they ever think about learning English. Most significantly is that those children are all over the United States. A recent report by the National Academy of Science at least identifies that probably no teacher in the United States will have the privilege of not teaching a child who comes to them who does not speak English. So it is everywhere, including Arkansas, where the greatest growth has been in the Southeast in the United States. However, it's important to point out that these kids are also citizens. Over 90% of children under the age of 6 who speak a language other than English were born in the United States. They're not immigrants. Their parents may be immigrants, one or two of their parents may be immigrants, but they're not. They're U.S. citizens. So policy has a particular impact on our citizens. We don't need to debate whether they're aliens or immigrants or undocumented. They're citizens. And we have responsibility for our citizens outside of debates about whether we have responsibilities for others. What are some of the policy issues then that confront these kids? One is one that California faced, the nation faced, is, well, we can't speak anything to them besides English because they need to learn it as quickly as possible. Scientific evidence suggests that learning a language other than English before you confront English in a place called school is actually pretty helpful. And going on to take care of the native language while they learn English is also helpful. It produces a better student, overall well-being, and family engagement. So all those things that we've talked about this morning and this afternoon, we need to worry about policies that essentially restrict educators from essentially speaking and supporting that native language. And in many cases, prohibit families and discourages families from speaking that language. It's actually quite enriching to speak a language other than English before you learn English. So leave that very clear. Very also important to understand that every child has the capacity to learn 2 languages. So the policy really that relates to English learners is only to those kids, but everybody can learn another language. Clearly, some states and some cities are essentially developing dual language programs. So there are policies now driving the fact that all kids should learn another language. If we want to reimagine education with regard to languages, everybody should have access to it. Can your brain handle it? Yeah, it can. It's amazing. It can handle it. It can handle it when you're little. It can handle it when you're old. It can do all of that. Brain architecture, no problem. In fact, dual language learners, bilinguals' brain architecture generates some advantages. Besides dealing with Alzheimer's, it generates better executive function in young children. It organizes, it helps them organize their future. So policies that restrict access to the native language, that don't allow bilingualism to flourish for all children is problematic. Policy lever that's also significant to this population is how we prepare and support teachers. We all have certain credentials that people have to have, et cetera. And clearly, if we don't have individuals in the workforce who can handle kids who do not speak English, there's a problem. We do survey after survey that indicates this is an area teachers continue to say, I'm not as prepared as I should be. Policies essentially that allow us, like ESSA now, allows professional development in this area. Do districts and schools do it? Not clear, but the policy's there. Supporting, preparing teachers is absolutely critical. One other one, if I could, and that is, as the superintendent of Miami said so eloquently this morning, we need to invest in early childhood education. What helps the dual language learners, English learners the most is starting early and supporting that language, supporting that native language, introducing them to English in a context that worries about the whole child. Early childhood educators do not educate children. They work with the whole circumstances of that child. We heard yesterday in a forum here that relationships are important. Dual language learners and early childhood educators know about social-emotional development, about relations, about understanding differences, about dealing with diversity. We can do that very well when kids are young. For dual language learners, your own data in California, the transitional K evaluation by SRI suggests dual language learners age 4 going to kindergarten who get dual language programs in early childhood do very, very well in getting prepared for kindergarten. Those are the policy initiatives that I think are significant for this population.
So thank you, Dr. Garcia. In a moment when national policy and policy discourse too often is dehumanizing and focuses on exclusion, Dr. Garcia's comments remind us that policy also can be about inclusion and validating the ideas that we want to uphold. Let me turn to Dr. Kerp, who has been studying schools around the country that are enacting some of this whole children, whole community approach. And if you can speak a little bit about the difference that these schools make and what sorts of policies these stories tell us we need to enact this in a more systemic way.
Well, thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here. I don't have to tell you that if you pick up the newspaper or listen to radio or TV or read online, is this on? Oh, okay. How about that? Is that better? Yeah. Okay, sorry. So it's all bad news bears, right, out there, basically. You get the scandals, you get the violence, you get all those kinds of things. I mean, the bottom line message is the public schools are broken, and they're unfixable, and what you need is charter schools, vouchers, whatever. Those of you who come from Los Angeles, I don't have to tell you about how much money, how many millions of dollars were spent in the last school board campaign to persuade voters that that was the case, persuade them successfully. I spent a lot of time in the schools themselves. I've been lucky enough was lucky enough to spend a year embedded, I guess that's the right word, in a poor Latino immigrant school district called Union City, New Jersey. It's about 5 miles and a light year away from New York City, from Manhattan. And more recently, as someone who's writing a fair amount for the New York Times, I get to find interesting places to go to and hold them up as success stories. And I will tell you this about the New York Times. You send an email to somebody, and before the ink is dry on that email, they've responded. I mean, people are willing to engage in that. And my hope always is, when I write about places, that they use the hell out of them, that they lift up those stories. I think the reason that the pieces that I write wind up being in the top 5, top 10 most emailed pieces is that readers care about education. They like stories. The 7 most irresistible words in the English language are, let me tell you a story. Works for 6-year-olds, works for 85-year-olds, right? And there's some evidence behind these. I'm a policy guy. So they're not just good stories. They're stories with context. So let me tell you a bit about these 2 communities and the larger message. I can really speak to both of them together. Union City, poor Latino immigrant town, the most crowded place in the state, not because they're big, high buildings, but because you've got a lot of families living 4 or 5 in one room, locked door, a shelf in the refrigerator. They're mostly immigrant families. The guess is that about 1/3 of them are undocumented. The language at home is Spanish, not English. It's the telenovela, and football, not football, that's going to be watched. Those are the places which, as Jean was suggesting, are often the places, where kids get effectively wastebasketed. And so the reason you should pay attention to Union City is those kids graduate at rates higher than the national average, and 75% of them go on to college. And those that don't have really good training in a whole array of vocations at the school. Now, the reason you should pay attention to Union, Oklahoma, which is right next to Tulsa. Some of you have heard about Tulsa's really good preschools and the data that show the long-term positive effects of early education. But Union was a white middle-class suburb, and then about 10, 15 years ago, white middle-class families started moving out, and poor and immigrant families started moving in. So the graduation rate 15 years ago was about 80%. The graduation rate now, 70% free and reduced price lunch, again, families mostly speaking English, is 95%. So you get the point, right? These are places that are, quote, defying the demographic odds. That is, they really are capitalizing on kids' desire to learn and communities' willingness to be supportive. And while there are differences between these places, and I have endless stories to tell you about them, which I'm not going to have time to do, the key is building a system of support, a system based on relationships. Nobody who's asked, what was the biggest influence on your life? People are going to say, they say a teacher. They're not going to say a computer program, I don't think. They're going to think about a teacher that they had. So that system of support begins with really good early education. 2 years in New Jersey, mandated by the court. A year mostly in the public schools in Tulsa that the legislature adopted. A really rich language-soaked curriculum. You just are drenched in language, and for the non-English speaking kids, they follow that precept that you start with the native language and you work slowly to build competence in that language, because we know that if you don't really learn your language, you never are going to be totally comfortable in any language. So they transition to English. In both places, teachers get a lot of support. They get support from other teachers. They get support from coaches. They don't send their teachers off to, I don't know how many teachers there are in the room, a lot, I would guess. You go off to those conferences, they're called spray and pray, right? Think about it. These are folks, these are coaches who come into the classroom and work with the teacher, and it's kind of watch one, do one, teach one. A lot of these teachers who need help at the outset wind up being the folks who are coaching other teachers. They test those kids a lot, and in a way that the quote reformers, and by the way, I tell this to my students, if there's a new issue, claim that word reform, because it's not a neutral word. It's now been, right, we've lost it. That's why we're in the transforming business. So they use those tests to figure out where there are problems. Problems the kids are having, problems the teachers are having. Classically, folks who teach in the public schools know one of the things the kids have the hardest time with are word problems in math. So, okay, how do you teach word problems in math? So you coach the teachers, and if there are a bunch of kids who are having problems, then you work with those kids. You don't punish the teachers. You know Ms. Jones is doing better or worse this year than she was last year. You know that Ms. Jones is doing less well than Ms. Chavez, or Mr. Enriquez. And you work with them, and you get those teachers to work with each other. The parents and the community are deeply involved. In Union, Oklahoma, before they'd ever heard the word community schools, they realized that they now had a population of newcomers who had no reason to trust the Anglo school system that existed. So they started by adding health clinics to the schools that were going to be open to everybody. Wow, that was a big deal, because now parents had some place to go for themselves and a place they could drop off their kids. And slowly, they build schools that are open, early in the day to sunset. They're open on Saturdays. They started with the schools that needed the most support. They worked there. When they figured that they were working, they worked their way out to the entire school system. And then they heard there's something called community schools. Not a new idea, by the way. And indeed, very few of the ideas we're talking about are new, right? We're just recycling stuff and giving it, deeper learning, deeper learning meets John Dewey. It's the same, it's really the same stuff rebranded. This is the project-based learning, the hands-on, all that stuff, right? This is not new stuff. In Union City, every place is a parent liaison. Often it's a political appointee, a kind of hack. There you've got someone who knows all of the parents, all the families, and knows, how do I get on the housing roster? How do I get a job? Can help with that. You need a winter coat. And if the kid doesn't come to school, they call those families. You've got strong leadership that's setting an example. It's high expectations. And I use the word abrazos, embraces, to talk about Union City. In Union, Oklahoma, the superintendent said, my God, look at this. We just lost 180 kids. This year from before they graduated. Does anybody know what's going on with John Smith or Mary Jones or you know, Bobby Hernandez or whoever? And nobody did. It was just an embarrassing moment. And so you get the superintendent and these folks going door to door to find out what's happening. And that's why you get the kind of graduation rate that you do. You get parents engaged. That's not, the good news, as I say, is none of this is new. Any educator with a pulse is going to know this. Nobody's going to disagree with any of what I've said. The bad news is that you got to keep doing it, and you got to keep doing it better. All this continuous improvement stuff is you got to be looking around and figuring out where are we, you know, what can we adopt, what can we do better, where can we learn from what it is that we're doing. And you've got to have stability. You've got to find good leadership and embrace it and support it and build it and train the next generation of leaders. We're a really impatient country. The average superintendent in an urban school district lasts fewer than 3 years. I don't care if you're a genius administrator. You can't change. You can't affect in a serious way. You only find the bathroom, you know, and where the bodies are buried by the time you're either out there looking for a job or they're out there looking for the next miracle worker who's going to it doesn't work that way. So one of your tasks, our tasks, is to find those folks who are willing to be system builders, because that's what we're talking about. And that means supporting teachers. It means supporting, you know, principals. It means connecting to the community. And ultimately, it means people who believe in a very basic precept around which you need to build a system, which is that every child deserves what you'd want for a child that you love. Thank you.
Thank you. To underscore Dr. Kerp's point that these ideas are not new, I could bring us back 20 years ago to a school that enacted the sort of whole child, whole community vision that's been articulated throughout the day, and it was the school led by Dr. Sylvie Rousseau in the late 1990s, Santa Monica High School. And you can see she's got lots of fans. Since she was a principal there, she went on to be an associate superintendent and then a clinical professor of education. So she has insight both from the school level and the district level about how we conceptualize policies that can make this sort of schooling systemic. Dr. Rousseau, can you offer us some insights on how we can move in that direction?
Thank you. I'll offer them. Let's see how thank you. This question of transforming schools is really, it's huge, and I've given it a lot of thought. And I'll just share some of my thoughts that may seem rambling, but I think they might help us. It led me to the question, I think I'm old, as you can tell, and I've been around for a while. And I think we've lost the way. I want to pose the question, why do we have schools? I think that's a question we have to grapple with. And I think people like us in this room and universities, when I hear Senator Elliott talk about trying to get legislation through, there's such a misunderstanding about why we have school, and we got lost in the weeds. I would love to see a national dialogue waged and led by educators. You know how people stormed into senators' offices for health care? We might have to do some of that here around education to force this dialogue. Because for many people, legislators don't pass legislation because they're uninformed and they all have different views about why schools exist. And very often schools exist for certain groups of people for their special interests. So I would like to see waging a national dialogue that involves all areas of the spectrum about why we have schools. Because I think what we've fallen into is that schools become, everybody accepts it's a place we keep kids till they're 16, or it's a place kids go for the day to stay out of trouble, and you get a high school diploma as your rite of passage. But really, what is it, and what metrics do we have? We have a lot of metrics and a lot of data on kids, But I think over the last 60 years, since the Brown versus Board of Education, wouldn't it be lovely to say, agree that in a democracy, we need to be clear about the role of schools in a democracy, and how are we doing? What are some metrics? Is there less racism in the country because of the way we've educated kids for the last 60 years? Are there fewer segregated and marginalized children in schools who we just have to push over the line to get a high school diploma? Is there greater understanding about how we take care of the planet? I think these are the questions we have to grapple with. Otherwise, I feel I've been guilty, as many of you may, that I've helped oil the machine about what schools are, but they missed the mark in terms of that. So I would love to see, that's one thing I would love to see. Some of you have heard me say this before, and I have a very strong view. A second thing is, I think every child's first option, I'm not a big options person, because I think we've had policies of avoidance and alternatives, rather than having the conversation and digging deeply about why some children are failing. Why do we have to do all these extra things we consider them to be for some children? And is it because we're avoiding some of the real issues that surround them? And we tend to see them, children, as the problem versus reflecting back on ourselves. What are the problems we're creating in the way we create schools that make it easier for some children to be successful and others not? And that trend goes on year after year after year. So I would like us to think about developing some metrics about how well schools are doing in fostering the well-being of children across the spectrum, and how well schools are doing in promoting the tenets of democracy. I often think of, and so I'd like to see policies like that, because I think our policies have been, all children are equal, but some are more equal than others. So that's kind of a paraphrasing of Orwell's, all animals are equal, but some are more equal than others. So when we continue to look at the data that just focuses on children, it will support that over and over again, that some children seem to be more important than others. So I think that I would love to have policy where we begin to examine how schools are perpetuating the kinds of things we're seeing in our climate today. And do we have an educated populace? And do we have people who are able to discern truth-telling? And do we have people who understand the role of science in maintaining the planet? Do we have children who are able to cross borders and have appreciation? And when we talk about language, I can't emphasize it enough, but I do want to include there's another group of English learners, and they are standard English learners. So, and they often get overlooked. And I believe children do not have access to the curriculum unless the language they have is honored, and that that language is used to help them acquire a second language, which is what we call academic English or standard English. But there are a number of children, African American children, who speak a language that's rooted in the syntactical and grammatical structures of West Africa, and they have an English vocabulary, but the syntax and structures are very different, so they can read English words all day long and still not make meaning because of the syntax. We need policies that honor and respect that capital, the language capital that children bring. And so I believe every child, this is a policy I'd love to see in every school district, every child's first option is a school in his or her own community that is providing quality learning experiences. Not the avoidance of giving them a choice here or there unless we've taken care of that first option of the child. And that should be a public school that is assessed by standards of excellence that are applicable to schools anywhere. It should be schools that are governed by democratically elected boards and protected from diverting resources to options of which there are never enough for every child to enjoy. So I think that that's a policy I'd love to see. Investing in the community school is essential, and investing in the community where those schools reside. And then another policy that I think is really important is that I'd love to see our schools as sanctuaries, not just from the draconian implementation and laws around immigration, and they're needed there. But I think children who come with differences, come with intellect that goes unrecognized, who come from conditions not because their parents are bad and because communities are bad, but that have been created by policies on health care and policies on employment and policies on housing and all of that. We need a national conversation to help our legislators and the public understand that these are not children who come to us broken, but they are children who are experiencing the effects of policies that continue to denigrate them and render them unable to access fully public education. And that's why I believe the community school is so important, that we garner those resources. Because when children's needs, basic needs, are taken care of and they are treated as human beings with dignity, those are children who learn. And that's part of the answer why we can predict test scores by zip code. And so I think schools have to be sanctuaries for children who have been so scarred by oppressions of unemployment in their communities, sanctuaries where relief from segregation and inadequate housing and health care. And if we can garner those, I think it helps us fulfill what our Constitution, our Bill of Rights say, that all men or women, children, people are created equal, that children are not born with deficits, and that when their needs are taken care of and a whole community gathers around and ensures that those needs are met, and that we honor what children bring as assets rather than always looking at them from a deficit perspective, and build on those assets in their communities. Help them respect their own communities and be a part of solving it instead of shipping them away across town somewhere hoping to find nirvana. So I would say that those are policies that I think we really need to give heed to, taking us back to saying, why do we have schools? Who are they for? What are they for? Why do they exist? And how can we really return to Dewey and think about the connection between education and democracy?
Thank you so much. I want to ask the senator a question, but as I do, if any of you have questions yourselves, you can line up at the two microphones on either side of the room. So Dr. Rousseau closed her comments by talking about community schools as a process through which the community gathers around the school and to support it. I'm wondering if that also represents a metaphor for policy and policy making, in the sense that we need to have radical participation across many different sectors, and if you can speak to what that looks like in order to advance some of these policies.
Well, I'll start with the given that, okay, so we're going to have politics, so that's going to be there, so how do you make it better and how do you have that radical participation? And just for me, one of the things that really galls me more than anything else are people who come with these great policies talking about a zip code. Every time we romanticize this notion that because I want to be a good person, I don't really know much about education, and I want to look as if I'm doing something without really having to upset my apple cart. So we talk about a kid's zip code, that no child should have to be a victim of the zip code, so you should have the choice to move from a school in your zip code. Well, my thing about that is then you are concentrating on the wrong thing. Concentrate on helping us change the damn zip code, not making the child having to go someplace else and then say we've done something fantastic. Well, the reason something like that has prevailed and caught on around this nation is that we have not had radical participation. And I cannot begin to even think about how that's going to happen, how that kind of thinking is going to change, unless we do discomfort ourselves and inconvenience ourselves to be in that arena. Maybe it would be a great thing if we woke up tomorrow and there were no more legislators in some people's minds wreaking havoc on school districts. But that's not going to happen until somebody is there to fill in the gap to say, no, this is not the way to do it. And as an educator, I have all kind of cred showing up as an educator. But I also sit there as a politician. And if people who are still out there, and this is the one thing that you are doing for the most part, if you show up, bring parents with you, bring students with you, or something even more radical, every legislator lives in some community somewhere. They're not your legislator unless they live in your district. You ought to require legislators to come and speak and talk to you and talk to parents, not always going to the legislator's turf at the Capitol. That's a good thing. But the folks right now doing something with this thing called, indivisible, you might have paid some attention to. They're not waiting to go to legislators' offices. They are demanding that in their community, where the metaphor really could be lived out, that we are going to hold our meetings, our talks, our conferences, and have you accountable to me in my community so all the community people can show up. And we don't demand this. And what's read by that, when we don't demand it, people start to think they're doing the right thing. I cannot emphasize to you enough that everybody is not doing this just because they want us to be upset. There are some people, of course, have great lobbyists, they have big money informing what they're doing. Lord knows, I live in the land of Walmart. That is where the headquarters is. So when I talk about how money and how power are influencing education and taking it away from what it should be, I have to say it right across the table from some of the very people who are funding what I think are going off the rails and keeping it off the rails. But I can't do it alone. And it is a great thing. Many times we will have a conference, but more than anything else, I know how this works back in our schools. We will have a conversation in the teacher's lounge, or if you have an office or whatever, and that feels all great, and then nothing happens because of it. And the kids are suffering because adults are not standing in the gap. We just have to have more adults standing in the gap and giving people the right information and demanding more. And they look for us not to, and when we don't, we get what we've gotten. And I think that, I said it earlier, but I really do mean this. There's nothing that prepares you to be in politics better than being a teacher. Because you have to deal with all kind of people all the time, figure out a different message from one child to 25 or 30 all the time. And you have to say things over and over and over and over and hope somebody's listening. Therefore, you have the patience of Job, most of you, if you've made it. And these are skills that are very helpful in politics, but you have to lead back in your communities, I think, is the bottom line.
Dr. Cooper, did you want
I just wanted two quick anecdotes in support of what the senator was just saying. In Texas, a congressional district was gerrymandered to get rid of a liberal congressman. I drove that district. It's a little string bean that sort of ran from George Bush's ranch down to the other Bush's public policy school. It's about 8 miles wide and 130 miles long, and it had 70% Republicans in it. Well, the Democrat won. How did the Democrat win? Because the candidate handpicked by Karl Rove to beat this guy, her big boast was, I cut millions and millions of dollars out of the Children's Insurance Fund so we can save money. And the TV ad is a mom with a daughter on her lap, and she says, I've got a good job now. I'm a widow. My husband died in Iraq. If I lose that job, I don't know what I'm going to do. So when you ask the voters when they left, what moved them, 15% of those voters were Democrats for a day because of just that one moment. And let me tell you, the Texas legislature never gets called in a special session except for things like the bathroom bill. Called in a special session, what bill did they pass? They restored that money for CHIP. A shorter story. In Chicago, the community groups are really well organized around early education. The bunches of they fight behind closed doors. They come out, here's our priority. We're going to do this. And every year they bus thousands of parents down to Springfield to do exactly what you're talking about. And one woman talks to her state representative and says, Senator, how do we get more money for early education? And he said, you know, ma'am, I wish I could have an answer, but I just don't know how. And she said, how can we elect somebody who does know how? Those are the parents that you want. Politicians are enormously risk-averse folks. You defeat a couple of them because they're bad to kids. Life is going to change a whole lot for the better.
Right. Terrific. Let's go to our first questioner.
Hi, this is perhaps a drill down on Professor Rogers' last question, although it pulls a bit of a thread from what you just mentioned about gerrymandering. Actually, anybody on the panel, I would be interested to know what you would say to what I'm about to ask, but if I may direct it to Dr. Rousseau. On the theme of community school, I'm wondering what strategies you recommend, or let's say also, aside from strategies, what priorities you see to take steps towards desegregation of the community schools that we are envisioning, particularly in places where, at the elementary level at least, we're talking about a neighborhood which is most likely a segregated community. What strategies and what priorities can you articulate for us to ensure that our community schools can be not segregated or can become desegregated?
A couple of things. So one, you're looking at long range. And number two, segregation isn't always between people of color and white people. But one of the things that I believe we need to do in community schools is that we very often have middle-class people leaving community schools looking for something over the horizon as a better place to be. So we need an integration within communities so that the whole community embraces. John talks about, Dr. Rogers, about being at Santa Monica. That school is the flagship for the whole community. And so I think that that's one thing. Integration and crossing borders, we find many of our schools now are heavily African American and Latino. There's a lot of work to do on desegregation right there. So that we don't define integration or desegregation by the presence, as we have historically, of only white people need to be present. And then the second piece is good schools lead to good communities, and good communities lead to good schools. And over time, the best strategy is to invest in those community schools, access the resources, treat the communities with respect, and draw upon their funds of knowledge. And the best strategy is to make that a great school, because people will come running back to that school. That's, I think, the best way to try to promote it.
Dr. Garcia, I know you wanted to weigh in.
I'm assuming that your school has children who come to school whose primary language is not English. And I could say 3 priorities which already exist within present federal policy under Title I, which are not being used presently and likely not at your school. We know that early childhood education is going to help them do well at 3rd and 5th grade. Yet Title I monies utilized for early childhood are less than 6%. So we're not using what we already have the capability to use. We're not touching it. Supporting teachers specifically to address the needs of English learners. 50% of the money in Title I can go for that in those schools that have it, and it does not. It goes to literacy, math, science, but not to support teachers who specifically are working with English learners. Family engagement is now allowable under Title I. It is federal policy. You can use money coming directly to your school to engage families. Not happening. Not happening. So I'd say those are priorities for English learners, family engagement, teacher support, and early childhood. And it's not being done now under present policy circumstances.
I would just add another thing. A lot of the money goes to remediation and intervention, as if these children are just deficit-laden, versus good professional development. I'm going to add standard English learners too, because as you see the literacy data separate, we find African American children have no sustained systemic way of transitioning or adding English, academic English, as their second language. So they're being asked to be literate in a language no one has helped them develop. But I do believe that there's so much emphasis on intervention and remediation rather than helping students access rigor and widening those opportunities. And if the school, we had integration with people who went all across town to go to schools and so-called integrate, wasn't because they necessarily wanted to sit next to a white child, but they wanted to access a good education. So our job is in wherever the community is, wherever the school, make it excellent. That will draw people.
Sir, it's now the case that community schools can be funded under Title I. And that it's the very same issue that Jean is raising. It's not going to happen unless there are folks pushing for it. None of this is going to happen unless there are folks pushing for it at the local, at the district level. That's where it counts, at the school board and with the school administration.
But I see a long-range issue here. Our neighborhoods became the way they are in so many ways because of housing policies. And from your question, I assume that it's important to you, as it is for everybody, for our schools to be integrated, whether it's race, economics, language, or whatever. But a lot of this, I think a big problem we have when it comes to the policy side of things, where legislators are in charge, I'm really trying to get our legislature to think about no longer trying to address the issues we have in education just in the education committee. Because in politics, we don't practice that metaphor that you talk about. We know all of these things like housing, transportation, health issues, and the other legislators, I'll keep saying this to you, are willing for that to be dumped on the 5 or 6 people who sit on the education committee. Those issues are never going to be solved in the education committee. So long range, what I wish we would think about, and then include ourselves, because we're not practicing what we preach when we say we want our schools to be places of democracy where kids learn to be around all kind of kids different from them. And then if we live in a neighborhood that does not look like that, and too many of us do. So there needs to be some kind of discussion when we're talking about this education discussion. What are we doing as a people to make our democracy what it should be by not running away from each other, by taking deliberate steps to live in a neighborhood where not everybody looks like you? These are things we can do and not just keep pointing at somebody else to do, but we have to work for it and not act as if for some reason, and I hear this all the time, particularly from my white friends, my kid is not going to be an experiment. I'm not going to move, as if it's okay if somebody else's child is an experiment or something. But these are the kind of questions we need to ask our personal selves. Are we okay with the schools being segregated? We must be if we choose not to live and take deliberative acts to do something about it by where we live, who our friends are. Because when it's unacceptable, we'll do something about it. But if it's acceptable, then we let the status quo sit.
So Thank you, Senator Elliott, and our entire panel. I think we saw in these final comments that as we begin to push back against policy, it calls upon us to double down on democracy and to think about how we can revitalize our civic life in a way that's more inclusive and respectful and participatory. Let's all thank our panel.
Thank you, Professor Rogers, and our panel again. Folks who've dedicated their entire career to a whole child, whole community policy agenda. We're going to finish out the day with a pretty incredible group of people as well. So I'd like to welcome to the stage the president of the Stewart Foundation, Jonathan Raymond. And Jonathan will be joined by three folks. Leda Garcia, who's the president of the UCLA Community School. Randy Weingarten, the president of the American Federation of Teachers. And Dr. Stephen Webb, superintendent for Vancouver Public Schools in Vancouver, Washington. Please join me in welcoming our panel.
Thank you, Joe. And good afternoon, everybody. This is the final session. You've made it. And it's actually the most important, and we have the best panel for you here today. I'm gonna channel
Joyce is always the best panel.
That's right. I'm going to channel my best Kyra. I wish Kyra was here. But if everyone just kind of stand up for a moment and let's just take a little stretch and a little breath. And, you know, I'm not going to have you lean forward and back, but get a little bit of air. Okay, there we go. Excellent. Nice job. Love it when people pay attention. All right, great. You can't tell, but I have a lapel pin that's actually a sunflower. And I want to share a little story about how I got this sunflower. A really good friend of mine when I was superintendent in Sacramento was Mark Johnson. Mark Johnson, wonderful man of great integrity, a tremendous educator, superintendent in a small school district here in California, Sanger Unified. And Mark actually was the U.S. Superintendent of the Year a few years ago. He's now retired, but he gave me this sunflower pin, and he said, you know, he says, I wear this sunflower pin every day to remind me of kids, because children are like sunflower seeds. And he went on to say that a sunflower seed can stay dormant in soil for years until it gets the right amount of sunlight, the right amount of water, and those soil conditions that Sir Ken talked about. And then, of course, we know what happens, right? With just those right conditions, that sunflower just becomes brilliant and magnificent. And that's what our children are. So he said, I wear it because we can never, ever, ever give up on even one child, because they're brilliant. Because they're brilliant. I want to pose to you a question for you to consider and to think about, right? So when we come back at the very end of our conversation today, what are the things that haven't changed that need to change that you've heard today? So think about that. What hasn't changed about what needs to change, okay? That's my first question. My second question is we've been sitting next to folks we probably haven't even known all day long. So I want you to just take about 30 seconds each, introduce yourself to someone sitting at your table or near you. And if you have a child, ask or answer, what are the hopes and dreams for my child? And if you don't have any children, just say, you know, my hopes and dreams for children are, okay? Just take 30 seconds each. Someone near you, you know, what are the hopes and dreams for children, or the hopes and dreams for my child? Okay? Okay, about another 20 seconds. Okay, who wants to share? What did you hear? It doesn't have to be yours. Just shout them out. A couple. Have fun. What else? Be kind. How about a couple more? Be happy. How about this table over here? I can feel your energy. Be compassionate. Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you. Imagine a school, a classroom, a school district that put children at the center and guided itself based around those questions. Okay, just think about that. Lydia, good afternoon.
There it is.
What have you learned from leading your school that serves a large immigrant population about the possibilities for change?
I would think, or I would say that the first lesson for me has been how important it is to listen and to really appreciate the richness of each community and each family and what they bring to the school. I am an immigrant myself. I immigrated from Guatemala over 30 years ago. And I realized how different, even if I share that experience with many of the families, how different their lives are, my students' lives are. I wasn't an unaccompanied minor. I didn't come and live with a mom I'd never seen or a dad that I had only spoken on the phone with, once a month. So there are so many intricacies, I think, to the way that that issue plays out. And it is really, I just heard someone at this Salvadorian Consulate Forum around the contributions of immigrant communities. And one of the speakers talked about just really understanding the contributions and understanding the differences, and then really reframing the issue of immigration, not as a domestic one, but as a transnational one. Because everything that these families live through and do really impacts not just domestically here, like, oh, we don't want them, we do want them. They serve a purpose, they clean our houses. We don't want them to clean our houses, they take care of our kids. We don't want them to do that anymore. Or whatever else, however else we see them. The truth is there are these transnational connections that they represent really across countries. So I would say the first thing is just listening to understand what it is that they're bringing and what it is that they would like to see, and to understand the circumstances for that migration. And how they see themselves, right? I feel like there's so much talk about immigrants and immigrant families and their children, but rarely do you see the immigrant himself or herself explaining, this is who I am, this is my story. And so I think that's why it's so important at the school level to really listen to that and to really bring forth those stories and to then tailor and customize and personalize that education to who they are and to who the community is. And I think that's what we try to do all the time in our school through what we do, is to really try to listen and begin at that level. We all have ideas and opinions and areas of expertise, but it's really about listening to the people there and what it is that they might see as the greatest needs that really works. And I think for our school in particular, we're fortunate that in partnership with the university, some of the specific research that happens at our school drives then what we do at the school level. A few years ago, there was a study that really revealed to us the high percentage of undocumented students we have. And when I thought about my own knowledge about the DREAM Act, or just these different areas in which students would need support for financial aid to access college, because we emphasize that. We talk about education being the key, and yet there's 20,000 more roadblocks if you are undocumented. Ways in which California at least has been able to address, but how much knowledge do we have and who are we building this knowledge with? So it doesn't just live with the counselor, but rather with the families as well. So that study has really driven a lot of how we view the issue. I think another one specifically to our immigrant population was a study around newcomers, especially unaccompanied minors, and their socio-emotional needs and how they were experiencing our school. Because in writing, and even if you walk through our school, you can sense this communal kind of feeling. We are like a family. We're at TK through 12, so we see our students grow up with us, and that's our motto, where we grow together. And yet, through that study, and this woman who had been a social worker by training and was now in public policy, we learned just how different and alienated our newcomers really felt. And just how, even if a student was an immigrant just like them, the fact that they had a family made them feel so different from their own experience as, newcomers living with an older brother that they didn't really know, or a mom, like I said, that they had never really met. And so that led to some different ways of doing things, including creating an advisory for those students to have like a home base and to be very honest with them about the path that they would need to take and the supports available. And for me, I feel really successful within those spaces when I see our newcomers reaching out to other people in the school. So not just me, but the social worker, the other counselors, going to the after-school programs, and then slowly integrating and believing that this system is there for them as well. The same with our families. But I think that doesn't happen unless we stop and listen and ask, rather than assume and think that we have all the answers and we know what's best and what's better. And like I said, even for myself, someone who could say, well, I come from the same countries as you, and I am an immigrant. I realize that now I live in a very privileged place. I go home and I don't worry about an ICE raid and about someone or my husband not coming home. I don't worry that my older son won't come back from work. I just don't have to. But when you live in that space every day, then I think it's important for all of us to step back and think, then what's the right thing to do to respond? And I think you don't see parent or student or teacher leadership really rise and just own the school space without you as the formal leader listening and asking the right questions.
Thank you. And I just want to follow up a little bit, because this is the time of day in the session where we get a little bit micro, right? Where we're offering ideas and solutions and things that our guests can take back with them. So take it out of your school and your system. How would that apply to another school or even another school system?
So again, I think as the formal leader, I think you do have a lot of opportunities. I mean, whatever space you are in the educational process, there are opportunities for you to rethink how you approach the problem solving, and whether you're including the people that you're trying to support and help in that process. And so I think that concept alone applies to anything that you would want to do. We try and we engage in using improvement science tools, and I think one of the biggest lessons from that for me has been, what is the problem, and are you really defining the right problem, and is that what your audience believes is the problem? And until you identify that, you're just engaging in coming up with solutions that, again, you might think are great, but really have no basis and no evidence. And I think it's important to think that, this is a micro way of looking at it, and it's one small system, but the truth is that is the only way to change anything, is to go to the source and to really engage the people who are living and dealing with the situation. I think our school is able now to share some of that learning. We're in a co-located site with 6 schools, 4,000 students total. We have 1,007, so we're like a quarter of that. But it's great, I've had students, leaders, parents start training other staffs on our campus about becoming a sanctuary school, and really teaching others about what it's like for them in that community and what the community really needs. And even though, our schools are going through WASC and other things, students and parents are saying, of course, we know that's important. We want our high school diplomas to really count. But we also want to feel really safe at the school and make sure that everyone knows where we are and what it's like here, as some of us head home. So again, I think that concept can apply.
Great, thank you, thank you. I want to move over to you, Randy, and again, welcome. And can you share with us some stories and examples that point to the power of community and labor school partnerships that have really supported student learning?
Yes, I can. We are putting this book out next week, which has a lot of them in it. It's called a Big Bet on Educator-Led Collaborations and Solutions. The reason I say that is because normally we don't actually do a compendium of things that we have funded through our own innovation fund. And we both in this book talk about the successes and the failures. And what we've seen, so I can go through a bunch of examples, but like I can go through ABC School District, Meriden, Connecticut. I could go through a bunch of different examples. The school that Steve Barr and I started in New York, which we were both in New York yesterday for a renewal application meeting with the SUNY Charter Association, and we're here today. But this is, if I may, I want to just follow up and build on what Kedra just said, which is that what we see in terms of successful places and successful community labor partnerships is what happens when you have a failure and how you get back up and how you engage. Because we're in a moment right now where everybody is really stressed. You know, there was a temporary euphoria, I think, on Tuesday, but this is a very different moment than a few years ago, where we were talking about how to actually deal with white privilege, how to actually engage in equity. Now we are actually fighting issues of fear-mongering and race baiting, and fighting in many schools that my members are in, the same issues of kids being absolutely petrified about whether or not their parents will be home, or whether they're going to be picked up, or any number of things, including trans kids and bathroom issues, and LGBTQ kids, and black kids, and Latino kids, and a white kid who's not a Trump supporter. I mean, it is just goes on and on. So I think what we've learned is that these community educator partnerships, whether you want to call them community labor partnerships, community educator partnerships, these are absolutely vital right now. And they're vital for a lot of reasons. First, it completely changes the dynamic from being top-down compliance-based to, if you really have a community labor partnership, then it's responsibility-based. And instead of the rules being, well, what is the Board of Ed telling us we should do, or Betsy DeVos or whoever else, it becomes, how are we engaging together to purposely fulfill a mission that we all believe in, which is our kids' success. And then what happens is the checks and balances becomes the responsibility to each other. I often now say community is our new density. So how do you have enough voice and agency of the membership so that they feel engaged in it? Not like, oh, their union is telling them to do this or somebody else is telling, but they feel really engaged and really professional. And then the community feels welcome enough, and particularly kids feeling safe and welcome enough, and welcome and safe enough to have a fight over issues without hurting, without people feeling like, oh my God, we're in each other's, we're not in the same tribe anymore. And I want to just pick up on two words you said: engage, 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 engage. And you talked about it in terms of listening. I think about it in terms of three things we've learned from teaching. Walk in each other's shoes. It's not what's said, it's what's heard. And you meet kids and families where they are, not where you wish they would be. And so what community labor partnerships do when they work well is that they actually do these things together. They define success together, as opposed to somebody else defining it in terms of, what is it in California? Is it API scores still, or is it something else now?
It's something else now.
Something else now? What? The dashboard, excuse me. But and it takes, when you have a partnership like this, like take ABC School District, it takes the jargon out of what we do. So it makes things like community schools real. What are the needs? What are we going to do? Okay, if our kids, like in McDowell County, West Virginia, and then I'll stop here. In McDowell County, West Virginia, which is the 8th poorest county in the United States, it's in southwestern Appalachia, southwest Virginian Appalachia. It's where coal was king in the 1950s, and now it is a completely impoverished area where every single other kind of top-down reformy kind of thing was tried and failed. And so the then governor's wife asked us, the union, to take it over. And I said, look, we don't believe in privatization, and that would be privatization. But we will work through a community labor partnership to try to do something. Now just picture this. The two people that did this work is an African-American minister, Leah Daughtry, and a gay, Jewish, short, loud labor leader from New York City in southwestern West Virginia. 6 years later, 150 partners later, the graduation rates have gone up double digits. Pregnancy rates are down. Opioid addiction rates are down. But that's not what's successful to me. What's successful to me is when I see our kids come through a partnership that we have with AT&T, who fund us going to Charleston for a week and to Washington, D.C. for a week. And every single one of the kids that have been in this mentorship program have graduated from high school. They're going to college, the Army, or into some vocational training. And they look at you now, and they look you right in the eyes, and they are seizing their lives and feeling like they have a life ahead of them. And their parents are as proud of it, and their grandparents are as proud of it as they are. That, to me, is a successful community labor partnership.
Starts with vision. Stephen, how have you helped to broaden the conversation and to work with your community to really think about the purpose of education? And can you give us some examples that not only from what you've learned in Vancouver, but how that could apply to other school systems?
Sure. Well, good afternoon. Thank you for hanging on, all of you equity and excellence for all warriors in the House. Let me frame some context here first and foremost. I want to craft a hopeful narrative, a hopeful vision for public education and children in America. There is transformational work that is happening all across this country that fundamentally is transforming student trajectories by leveraging relationships and partnerships in such a way that remove barriers to student success in classrooms, in schools, and in community. In fact, we can see the great good work that's happening in New York City, Oakland, Grand Rapids, Baltimore City, and in Washington State, Highline, Tacoma, and Vancouver Public Schools. That's America's Vancouver, right across the river from Portland, Oregon. We serve 24,000 students in 37 schools. In 2007, 2008, we engaged our community in a visioning, futuring process to reimagine schools of the future. Part of what we were confronted with from a contextual context or contextual frame is rapid urbanization of what has historically been a suburban school system. So I invite you to think a little bit about your own community and see if any of these data points resonate. 45% of our students today are children of color, double over the past 2 decades. 25% of our students come from homes where a language other than English is spoken, double over the past 2 decades. In fact, we serve over 92 different languages in Vancouver Public Schools. 14% of our students are second language learners. And we've seen a significant increase in students that qualify for subsidized meals, double over the past decade, peaking at nearly 60% 3 years ago. So our community engaged in a conversation about what do we need to do differently? How do we think about the work of schools and community together? And it really does take a village, schools, families, and community interacting as partners to strengthen opportunities for kids to learn and grow. Listen, all kids have 3 universal needs: to feel safe and secure, to feel loved and a sense of belonging, and to feel competent and capable. This is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. This is simple stuff. If a child is hungry, it impacts their ability to learn. If a child does not know where they are sleeping tonight, it will impact their ability to learn. And when we think of our community schools efforts that we launched in 2008, we now have 18 family community resource centers, a whole systems approach, a whole community approach to thinking about removing barriers to student success, not just in classrooms, but in homes and in community. Listen, friends, our good friend Pedro always says poverty is not a learning disability, but it does present real barriers to too many children in our schools and in our country. And so what we've done is we've gone unapologetically outside of our lane. We offer mental health services in our schools, healthcare services, vision services, dental services, nutrition and food supports, job training and education services. It's really fundamentally about building assets in children and families and community as a way of getting more kids across the finish line. I want to share some data with you that I think speaks to the power of this whole systems, whole community, whole child approach. Since 2010, we've realized the following positive gains: a 21-point increase in early kindergarten literacy, a 20-point decrease in third grade English language literacy gap. These are our most challenging learners in our schools. A 30% decrease in middle school DNF rates, and a 40% decrease in DNF rates in our high schools. 120% increase in middle school honors course enrollments, and a 200% increase in students of poverty enrolled in IB and AB classes. This is about access and opportunity. 57% of recent graduates were enrolled in dual credit courses while in high school. We've seen a 70% increase in SAT, ACT test takers, with a composite score increase on the SAT improved by 40 points. That's inverse the national trend, right? As you increase access, what we typically see is declining results on the composite score. And what we're most proud of is an 18-point gain since 2010 in our on-time graduation rate, from 64% to 82%, with African American students and Latino students making the greatest gain. Now, we have work to do, but fundamentally, this is about resourcing and aligning supports in such a way that create the opportunities to set young people up for success in our classrooms and in schools and in neighborhoods.
Great, thank you, thank you. How about questions? We must have some questions. Come on up.
Good afternoon. So I've been grappling with this one issue really for several years now, and it's a little uncomfortable to ask it maybe in this room, about how the charter movement and the traditional public schools, how do we all move forward in this transformation where, you know, kids, I know everybody, they're in their heart, that's what they want, the best for kids. But when we talk about resources that, you know, can be limited and time, how do the panelists and, you know, professionals in this room, I'm just curious how we put that in the conversation moving forward, and what would your advice and next steps or thoughts be?
Who would like to start on that?
I know it's loaded, but.
Well, it's a different conversation in LA than it is in other places. And so it's a very different, it's a different conversation here. The people would be shocked to know that Al Shanker, one of my predecessors, was one of the people who thought about charters and pushed the idea of charters many decades ago. And he did it during a period of time that, you know, that there was tremendous compliance through very kind of bureaucratic structures, let me just say it that way. And he wanted, his vision was to have parents and teachers work together to outside of that main system to try things like small schools, like performance-based consortiums, like so many of the other ideas, and to see if something would work, then to bring it, you know, basically a research-based idea, saying if it works, bring it into the mainstream. Let it be an incubator. What has happened is that the idea has been hijacked in many different ways, and I don't mean that word in a negative way right now. I mean that it's now a competitive model. And when you try to compete and try to create markets in education, when we're all talking about what do we need to do to actually meet the whole child and whole child's needs and do it for every one of the 50 million kids in the United States of America that go, most of whom go to public school. And then all of a sudden there's an issue about monies going back, that monies get diverted and things like that. It has become a very, very dicey conversation. And when there's that kind of competition, as opposed to how do you create a way that you help all schools become good schools. And in the last panel, and I completely agree with one of the panelists that said, good schools make good communities. And when you see the closure of schools, you see communities that don't have neighborhood public schools, when you see that that hub of a neighborhood goes bye-bye, when you have a Secretary of Education that doesn't seem to care about accountability or transparency, and on and on and on, and just wants to and seems to care or believe that choice, private school choice, is the be-all and the end-all, you start having a terrible conversation and debate about this, particularly in light of austerity in 34 states, spending less on education today than before where their needs are greater. So I don't mean to make news here. There needs to be the people who believe in public schooling on the charter side and on the traditional public side. If we really should, it is incumbent on us to find a way to get together and try to create a way of resolving this. Because if we don't, there are so many greater forces at us right now that are undermining democracy, undermining equity, undermining justice, undermining rights, undermining opportunity, undermining freedom, that I do think it's incumbent on us. I don't know the path in LA, but I do think it is incumbent on us to try to figure out some of these issues.
Yeah. Any others?
Yeah, I would add decades of research demonstrate the correlational relationship between poverty and student achievement in schools, classrooms. But yet, as a nation, we have a tendency from a public policy perspective always to treat symptoms rather than get at root cause. I see some heads nodding. Amen? Amen. Friends, we need high-quality neighborhood schools. We need the village to rally around every child. And we have to, as school system leaders, invite the kinds of partnerships that actually leverage resources in such a way to accelerate student achievement and close opportunity and achievement gaps. I want to share some more data with you. Our community schools work, since we scaled in 2008, the number of partnerships that we have in Vancouver supporting our community schools initiative has grown from 22 to 750. If you build it, they will come. For every dollar that we invest in district staff to resource those centers, we net $4 in return. Last year, $4 million in community-based resources, removing barriers to student success in neighborhoods, in schools, and in classrooms. That is a hopeful vision for public education in America.
Great, thank you. We have another question.
Ingrid Gannell, United Teachers Los Angeles. So I have to say this has been a very spectacular day. I'm not looking forward to my commute home. But I just want to say I'm frustrated that not a single classroom teacher was on any panel. That is, to me, is very frustrating, and I think there's a disconnect. Earlier we had the president-elect of the AERA talking about there's research here and why isn't it being implemented? Because there's a lot of people that come to these things that aren't in the classroom. But my question or comment to the panel is, when we talk about community schools, specifically in Los Angeles Unified, we educate our students between $10,000 and $11,000 per pupil, but we incarcerate at over $75,000 per prisoner, or whatever term we're using nowadays. In the state of California, we're the 46th in per pupil funding. UTLA has a campaign, 20 by 20. Fund our schools at $20,000 by the year 2020. It's possible, other states do it, and they're not the 6th largest economy in the world. We would like a lot of our policymakers to come on board with this and get this accomplished, $20,000 for our students, so we can do things like community schools where we have green space. I'm from East LA. We don't have green space at a lot of our schools. Where we have things like the wraparound services that you spoke about in Vancouver, Washington. We dream about these things. In fact, we are bargaining for the common good. In our bargaining right now, in our contract negotiations, these are things that we are asking for. $1 million for our dreamers, for our DACA students. These are things that we are asking for. But the dichotomy is, when we have schools that go ahead and do these things, where they have parent centers or they have computer labs, Prop 39 comes and takes those spaces away and gives them to charter schools. And I'm not saying negative things about charter schools. We represent over 1,000 charter teachers in United Teachers Los Angeles. But there's a dichotomy when we talk about dreaming, and those dreams are taken away by laws. So I was just wondering if the panel could, I don't know, answer or address. Thank you.
Or both.
Dichotomy.
Leda.
Yeah, we're in LAUSD. That is our space. That's where we live. And I think what's difficult, or how I've come to see it, I've worked in 2 other districts, both of which were smaller. And I think what's hard, right, is when you go so big, you try to account for everything and synchronize everything and everything has to look a certain way because you're getting, 7,000 data points every day about something. Unfortunately, then you lose, I think, the potential and the vision and the organic nature of what schools should be like if they're really community driven. And I don't know that I have an answer about how to do it, except to say at the school level, I know I learn a lot from my teachers, and I appreciate that they're always bringing forth issues that matter and that they're always making me rethink things. And so I think building teacher leadership is essential to doing that. Not in a, all administrators are evil and, we don't deserve, whatever that division might be, but rather in how do we work together. And I think it's the same for student leadership and parent leadership. And it's not until we put that pressure, I think we all have to put that pressure on the system, right? And the same with principals then back into the system. And we may have less contractual sort of securities in doing that, right? Like we're at-will employees and can come and go as the district decides. But at the same time, I feel like it's not worth fighting for if you don't have a lot to lose. And I think I've learned that from my teachers. If it was easy to win this, then we wouldn't be fighting for it. When you think about the civil rights, you think about anything big that people have taken huge risks for, it's because it mattered and it was going to make a huge difference. And so I would invite everyone, students, parents, teachers, to then push back on the system, but help re-envision what that can look like and bring those ideas and solutions about what it could be like. And I feel like, again, for me, it's the parents, who are saying, well, we're not happy with this. This isn't working, right? And it's true, some things aren't working, and I'm not going to try to reframe the issue or make it seem like it is when they're seeing it and they know which things aren't working, and they might have some great ideas about what we can do. The same with our teachers and our students. So I think getting it back again to the communities to build that sense of ownership is going to continue to be essential. And all of us helping each other become braver and bolder. And I always thank my teachers, my students, my parents for helping me do that. Everything we do, I feel like, well, it's because it's coming from the community and they're saying, no, this is what we want here. And so then we come along and do it together. But I think it is going to take all of us to take some courageous moves in doing that and not just stay with the status quo and just accept that maybe that's just how things are and are going to be.
Yeah, Randy, I know you had something you wanted to add.
So Ingrid is completely right. I mean, it is the way when you talk to classroom teachers or frankly, most educators in America, particularly educators in big cities, rural areas, or places that don't get a lot of funding, you hear the same frustration. And the frustration, and that is to the question that was earlier, the frustration of somebody, think about it, who is in a charter school and has a lot of big funders supporting them. And so the charter school has all these computers and all this wraparound services and all these college counselors, and maybe it's in the same exact building as the public school that has none of this, and we're still using chalk on blackboards or green boards. And someone is and has the love. I know this teacher. She's in and I know many of the UTLA members. Go into their classrooms. They're really remarkable teachers who care and care and figure out and do all those things you just said. But when there's no funding for lowering class size or for the community schools or for the kind of dreams, and then a charter school comes in and says, I'm going to take your building now, and says, oh, by the way, we're going to take the funding away from you. It is, I mean, the fact she didn't scream it and said it showed tremendous discipline. And that's why I said earlier, I don't know how to solve it in LA. In other places, we are fighting 34 states spend less money on schools today than they did in 2008, when half the kids in America are poor. Half the kids in public schools are poor. And excuse me, and half the kids in public schools are now kids of color. So, yes, you're right. We have to actually do that fight together, and this is a civil rights fight, and it's a justice fight. But I think I would just ask, listen to what teachers are saying. Give them the benefit of the doubt. They went into this work because they want to make a difference in the lives of kids. And that's why trusting them is really the first step in actually recreating and reimagining education.
I think we have another question. Yeah, thank you, sir.
Hi, can you hear me okay? My name is Oren. I'm actually not in education. I'm just a business professional, so I walked in here. So excuse my ignorance if I'm totally off key. But it's been great hearing all you guys talk all day. And one question that stands out to me is, how do you protect yourself from not managing to the numbers in education? And what I mean by that is, what else do you measure as a leading indicator that you're making progress, and how do you not just measure for numbers and literacy rates and stuff like that? Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. It does. Stephen, you used a lot of numbers.
I did.
So let's have you take this one.
Well, let me say I could not agree more. Listen, we need to create the context and conditions where those three universal needs are met each and every day. I have a son who is a fifth grader, who was adopted from the Congo, and he has a learning disability. And I have hopes and dreams and aspirations for him, just like every parent for their children. So when we look at these kinds of leading indicators, we track 24 student learning key performance indicators that are broader and more bolder, in my opinion, of student engagement, student success, and student achievement. Some of those, of course, are lagging indicators like on-time graduation rates. But we know that if we track the degree of engagement as self-reported by students, we'll have some sense of correlating that with the kinds of observations that are happening with principals and central office administrators as part of our walkthrough exercises. But at the end of the day, kids need to enjoy and love learning. And we have to create the kinds of learning experiences that fundamentally get at these sort of future-ready skills, right? This notion of creativity and collaboration and critical thinking and communication and citizenship. So it isn't just the results that we've achieved through community schools. It's looking at an entire system and all of the kinds of inputs that really get at the kinds of outcomes that we can achieve together.
Yeah, great. I think I see a question over here. Thank you.
Thanks. So I had a question. Throughout the conference, we've talked a lot about the community schools, the notion of partnering with organizations in the community to improve not just the academic outcomes of students, but the health and emotional and mental well-being, from maybe helping them find jobs to addressing their immigration status to providing vision and dental care and partnering with these outside agencies to do that in a space where we don't have with shrinking funds where maybe our schools can't do that themselves. But my question is what do we do then when some of these partnering organizations, the community-based organizations, when maybe they change or shift, or their grant funds end, and the programs that maybe were there go away or shift? Is that something you've seen as a problem? Is there a way to make sure that when maybe that leader in the school moves on who was dedicated to these things, or that organization changes its mission or has different funding, how do we continue to make sure that that schools are a place that does this kind of work, I guess.
Yeah, in Vancouver, we talk a lot about going slow to go fast. So it's about thinking tactically and strategically as you scale this work, not just internally, but with your external partners, because transitions occur, funding sunsets. So how do we sustain the work in such a way that isn't necessarily about a service provider or a revenue stream, but it's the kind of supports and outcomes we want to achieve, and we're constantly curating those kinds of relationships and partnerships in such a way that enables us to grow thoughtfully and strategically and methodically.
There are lots of different models for community schooling, but probably most important is the kind of what do families, kids need in a school, and how do you radiate out from that? And the partnerships can change a lot, and the funding issues are real, and all of that is real. But what I experienced this year was when when the Trump administration attempted to cut $9 billion out of, basically cut Title II, Title IV out of schools this year, because there are so many community school networks around the country, I saw people get together to fight that together more than I've ever seen before. That people are actually seeing that safety of kids and well-being first and foremost is really important before they're just saying, okay, how is this going to help my bottom line? But, you know, part of what I think we all have to do is figure out how to get people ideas about sustainable models so that if one funding source goes bye-bye, then you know kind of the sustainability plan. And that's important both in terms of academics as well as the wraparound services.
Yeah. I think what I would just add to that is to connect back to this idea that I think part of the problem is that everyone expects the school to solve every societal problem that's ever, happening, or future ones that we haven't even seen yet. And I think that really is problematic, because here's this one institution, one building with certain skills and expertise that's supposed to solve everything. And so I think that's why partnerships matter, because it should be that it isn't just educators understanding and caring about the future of communities, societies, and our democracy. So I feel that we all have a responsibility as well to make sure that it's not just, oh, who's going to throw money at us? Okay, we'll take it, whatever you want. Because I think then that really belittles, one, the work that schools are trying to do, the needs that families do have. That again, we have to go back to saying, what is it that we're trying to solve and how? Otherwise, I feel like people, again, have their ideas. They went to school, so they think, oh, I know what they need. This is what they need. Or these are the students who should get the help, and these maybe not so much. So I think there's an educational piece for all, including the partnerships, about how to invest in school so that it's not just seen as I'm giving money to this building and this group of people, but rather I'm investing in an entire community, a city, a society, a democracy. And I think that that's really important for us to be able to do too, so that we're really supporting them in the school. If that's the place where we think everything will be solved, that then we have different partners coming together to really address the issues with different areas of expertise. Rather than just putting it all on the school ultimately, and there's just a funding thing there, and if you didn't meet my metrics, then I'm done with the partnership, then I feel that that's unfortunate, because then you've missed the whole point about what it is that communities might really need.
Didn't I tell you it was a panel worth sticking around for? Let's give them a really big hand. And as I turn it back to Pedro to close us out, I want to get back to that question I asked you a little bit earlier about what you might have heard today about those things that that haven't changed that really need to change, right? We heard about the power of relationships. We heard about this notion of grassroots and working from the outside in. We heard about the importance of working together and partnerships. And of course, we heard about the power of children. So it's been a pleasure, and I want to turn it back over to Pedro.
So once again, I want to, first of all, thank the two foundations that supported us, the Stewart Foundation, which Jonathan Raymond is the president, and the California Endowment. And you heard from Robert Ross, Castle Redmond, I'm not sure if he's still here, but they've been with us in this process, in this work, and it's not easy. Sometimes when you just have an idea, to get funding to support that idea. That support's been essential. As you know, I was looking at this, the crowd dwindle, and the day went on. You know, we debated. You know, should we end it earlier? You know, LA people leave at 3. You know, to beat the traffic. And just to put in perspective, I'm a New Yorker. During the World Series, 7th game, 9th inning, right here in Dodger Stadium, people are leaving before the game's over to go leave because they want to beat the traffic. I said, well, this is LA, right? Who does that? So I thank you who stayed because I think that the conversation's been rich, that it's given us a lot to think about. So I don't want to complain about those who left because I appreciate those who stayed, particularly our speakers who I think added so much to this conversation today. So before I talk a little bit about where we're going with the center and what we're trying to do next, I want to share a story. A few years back, I was approached by a consortium. I don't know if this is working. A consortium that they'd been doing performance-based assessment in New York City for several years. They had a waiver from the state to not do the standardized test in every subject except for math. And they had evidence showing it was having a profound effect on kids. Their numbers for kids going to college and staying in college significantly greater than traditional public schools. And it was clear that this was working. And I knew it worked because my daughter went to one of those schools, a school of the future in Manhattan. And so we went to this, John King, while he was still Commissioner of Education in New York, before he got promoted to be Secretary of Education. And we presented the data, and we had a big group of educators with us, and he listened, and we said, we think it's time to increase the number of schools that can do this. And he said, no, I'm not going to support it. We said, why not? He said, because I can't trust the schools. Right? And it was a very honest comment, but how disappointing. All right, how disappointing. And yet another reminder, we can't wait for permission to do what's right. If anything came through today, we can't wait for the policies to be right. We can't wait for the political climate to be right. I think Ken Robinson said it probably best. If change is going to happen, it's going to happen from below. Right? That's where real change happens. If you think about it, yesterday, the election, today's Thursday, 2 days ago, we elected the first transgendered person in the state of Virginia. We elected a Sikh to a mayor of Hoboken, the town of Frank Sinatra, right? And we elected a Liberian immigrant to mayor of Helena, Montana. Wow. So although it might seem a bleak time, I would say that sometimes when you look at the local area, not as bleak as it seems. And that's where I think change in education is going to happen. And that's when we were thinking about this conference. It's true, there were lots of constituencies that were left off. Although we had the president of both of the largest teachers' unions in the country, we didn't have a classroom teacher here today. So we also didn't have a parent here today. We also didn't have a student here today, right? These are key constituents. Hard to imagine moving education without them. Now, we did have lots of students yesterday at our town hall, and many of us are also parents. You might even see some of my kids running around here soon. But you know, this is not the end, right? This is really the beginning. We don't think transformation happens through a conference. We think this is really just about planting some ideas and trying to get others on board. We think that the time is right. So a colleague on campus presented this idea to me, this idea of the three horizons. He said it's an idea from business. Right? And in business, we know that if you don't anticipate how to change, businesses go obsolete. If you think about the top 10 businesses in the country today are not the same as they were 10 years ago. Right? Sears, anybody, when's the last time you went to Sears? Right? Or even Kmart, okay? And so we live at a time where if you either change and adapt or you become obsolete. Now in education, because we've had relatively steady funding, even if it's been totally inadequate, schools have been able to survive, even when they're not successful. On one hand, that's a good thing, because in many of our schools, even many of our struggling schools, the schools they go to are the one place they're sure they're going to get to eat. The one place they're sure they will have heat in the building, adult supervision, some measure of safety, and maybe even lucky enough to get a nurse. They may be woefully inadequate, but in a society where there is no stability for children, particularly our neediest children, our schools are a vital part of the social safety net for kids. And that's why it's an indispensable institution. So the question is, how can that institution adapt to the change in the world we're in? And so part of what we try to do is to say that even amidst all the constraints caused by poverty, constraints caused by bad policies, constraints caused by just systems that don't work well, and they're real. Anybody who spends time in education knows it and becomes frustrated. But you also heard over the course of the day of change happening. You know, when you hear Jose Navarro describe what's going on out there in Pacoima, and I've seen it up close, you know, you see a school that's high functioning despite the challenges all around that community. And what's ironic, it shares a campus with other schools, and while many of those other schools are losing kids, they have a waiting list. And so change is possible. They started school 3 days early to do community building. I said, how do you get the kids to come? We said, we just tell them they have to come, and they come. We didn't ask permission. We just did it. Right? And you heard from Steve Webb talk about building a system of support in Vancouver. They saw the population change. They didn't wait until they had kids showing up hungry. They said, we know the needs are there. We're going to have to address and respond to the needs. So in this three horizons framework that comes from the business, say, you know, many of the businesses are stuck in that first level. Those are the businesses that usually go out of business. The schools we have might still be around for a while, but many of them, especially in LA, are losing kids. Okay? They're losing kids, and we know if you're in Los Angeles, this is a system that's not on a sustainable path. Okay? That's where it's at. Either financially, the whole system can't continue the way it is. So the real question is, how does this system change? And so it's going to take leadership, it's going to take communities, it's going to take parents, it's going to take teachers, it's going to take kids to start to think about how do we remake that model. Now, part of what we try to do today was to say we need to rethink the model on multiple levels. Right? We need to think about support systems that address the social and emotional needs of kids. Right? We need to think about how to make it more engaging, more stimulating, more challenging, so that we do some of what Ken Roberts, because the kids are coming curious. They want to learn. We can't allow that to get lost in schools. And then we know that we've also got to figure out how do we build partnerships with community organizations, with parents, because the schools can't do it all by themselves. And so even as we want to move to transformation, we can't move so fast. We can't pretend we're going to leap there beyond the constraints. We have to figure out how do we work within the constraints to do more. And so I want you to think about the process of change. Right? I was very active in the anti-apartheid movement as a student at Berkeley. And while we were in that movement, no one really ever imagined that one day apartheid would end, that Nelson Mandela would be free. We said it, free Mandela, but no one, we just didn't believe it would happen. And lo and behold, wow, it happened. And there was one point when a demonstration we were in at Berkeley, and there were shanty towns in front of California Hall, and the picture of that demonstration appeared on the front page of the Daily Rand in South Africa. We said, wow, they actually are watching what we're doing here. Desmond Tutu, the Archbishop, came to thank us. Several years later, I got to go to South Africa after apartheid ended. And I saw, you know what? Looks like apartheid is still alive and well in South Africa. Right? Not much has changed. The townships are there. And the inequities are as gross as ever. And then I heard a speech by Bishop Tutu. He said, yep, the process of change is slow. But millions more children now today are in school than ever before. Millions more children and families now have clean water and housing than ever before. And he continued to enumerate, to count, to measure the progress. He says, are we where we should be? Not at all. But are we where we were? Not at all. So the process of change takes time. Question is, which direction are we moving in? Are we moving forward or are we moving backward? I think that as we consider what's possible in our schools today and the hard work ahead of us, we can't lose sight of what the goals are. Right? We started by thinking in this center, where could we have an impact and on what kinds of issues? We said, well, this school to prison pipeline has definitely got to be one of them. Because we know right now that we are most likely to incarcerate the children we fail to educate. And we also know that when we educate children well, even when they're in corrections, the likelihood that they will return goes way down. And what's more, if we could change the way we discipline kids right now, we could put far fewer kids on that path to prison. And so we said, let's make this one of the areas we focus in on. We can't do everything, but we can at least work in partnership with schools and with the county. And Elliott County said, work with us, we're ready. They're doing performance-based assessment right now in Elliott County schools. And I was out there last January with Debbie Duardo, who was with us last night, the county superintendent. And we visited a school for a correction school for girls last January. She's here, she's ready. And we saw the kids doing project-based learning. They did a whole unit around immigration. And I met a young woman who was explaining her project. And it was all, they'd read a book called Enrique's Story about kids who traveled on the Beast. Right? That's what they call the trains they travel in on. And as she was talking, I said, I saw the tattoo on her face. Had a man's name on the face. And I asked her about it. She said, oh, that was my ex-boyfriend. And the teacher says to me, that's not the boyfriend, that's what pimps do. They mark their faces. I said, well, you know, we're in an environment now where the president doesn't want people like you to come anymore. She said, why doesn't he help us not to come? We'd rather be at home. If they really don't want the immigration, why don't make it possible for us to stay so that we can help our families? That's what we'd rather do. And I said, well, that's what we should be thinking about. Right? That is, the conversations in so many ways about what's possible, what we should do have been stuck. The conversation about education in LA has been stuck. We just witnessed the most expensive school board race in the history of this country, right here. What did we debate? Was it about change? I don't think so. And so if change is going to come, we're going to have to figure out how to get some traction around some ideas in some schools, in some communities that can result in real, genuine change, even if it's incremental, for the kids that need it most and for all kids. And so we're building a network. We've built a network now that involves charters and public schools talking together about math and how to improve it. And many educators who are in the same communities the first time talking to each other, and they say, wow, we've never talked with schools in these neighborhoods. And they're enjoying the chance to talk about something that matters. How do we get kids to improve their performance in math? And then finally, we're going to issue some briefs about the state of education for different groups of kids and what needs to be done to move the needle. Because we know that maybe the policymakers aren't ready, but there are lots of communities that are looking for help to figure out how to do a better job in educating the kids they serve. So I don't want to pretend that transformation is going to happen just because we had a conference. Right? It's not like that. I do hope that over the course of this day, and if you were here yesterday and you heard young people speak about what they want in their education, that we've won over some allies who are ready to work with us. And we have your names now in the database, so you'll be in touch, right? Because we think that if we can mobilize our supporters from different sectors, we can actually start to get things done. I shared the story this morning about that school in South Africa, in the townships, because I was so inspired to see that in the midst of such desolation, there was a community that was thriving, a school that was thriving because they had the power of the people, the power of vision, and the unwillingness to simply wait for the government to act. I think if you could do that in South Africa, you can do that here. And so I encourage you to work with us, and I encourage you to join us on this journey. And I promise you it's not going to be easy or quick, but I think it's going to be worthwhile. And I thank you. And I want to now invite, I promised her, because she wanted to say something yesterday, my youngest child, Ava, because she wanted to share something. She's an enthusiastic student at the lab school. Ava, what do you have to share with the crowd?
Hello, I'm Ava, and I'm 5 years old, and I'm going to recite a poem by Maya Angelou. You may write me down in history with your bitter, twisted lies. You may trod me in the very dirt, but still like dust or rise. Just like moons and like suns with the certainty of tides, just like hope springing high, still I rise by Maya Angelou.
Thank you for being with us. To be continued.